Welcome, weary travelers, to the shadows of South Park, Colorado, where humor meets its darkest edges and comedy dances with controversy. Tonight, we explore the jokes that pushed boundaries, crossed lines, and challenged audiences in ways that few animated series dare attempt. From religious satire to racial commentary, from tragic misunderstandings to uncomfortable truths, we'll journey through the moments when South Park's creators decided that some subjects were worth the risk of offense. So settle into your covers. Close your eyes like you're hiding from the angry mob outside, and let us drift together through the surprisingly complex world of comedy's most dangerous territory. Rest easy, and let's begin. In the intricate psychology of comedic transgression, where laughter emerges from the collision between social taboos and human curiosity, few creative endeavors have navigated the treacherous waters of offensive humor with the deliberate precision and philosophical complexity of South Park. The animated series stands as a singular achievement in the landscape of controversial entertainment, not merely because it dares to offend, but because it has developed a sophisticated framework for understanding why certain subjects provoke such visceral reactions, and how the act of crossing comedic boundaries can serve larger purposes in cultural discourse and social examination. The foundational philosophy that governs South Park's approach to controversial material operates on the principle of what creators Matt Stone and Trey Parker have termed equal opportunity offense, a democratic approach to satirical target selection that refuses to grant immunity to any group, ideology, or sacred cow based solely on their perceived vulnerability or cultural protection status. This philosophical stance represents far more than simple contrarianism or attention-seeking behavior, instead reflecting a deeply held belief that genuine equality requires the willingness to subject all human institutions, beliefs, and behaviors to the same level of scrutiny and potential ridicule. The psychological underpinnings of this approach reveal a sophisticated understanding of how power dynamics operate within comedic contexts, and how the direction of satirical attack fundamentally alters the moral and social implications of offensive humor. When Stone and Parker craft jokes that target religious institutions, political movements, or cultural practices, they consistently demonstrate awareness of the difference between punching up at established power structures and punching down at marginalized communities. Though their willingness to engage with both approaches creates the moral complexity that makes their work simultaneously celebrated and condemned. The concept of punching up versus punching down in comedy represents one of the most crucial distinctions in understanding when offensive humor serves constructive social purposes versus when it becomes genuinely harmful or cruel. Punching up involves directing satirical attacks toward individuals, institutions, or ideas that possess significant social, political, or economic power, using humor as a tool for challenging authority and questioning established hierarchies. This approach aligns with comedy's historical function as a form of social criticism that allows populations to express dissent and examine power structures through the relatively safe medium of laughter. Punching down, conversely, involves targeting individuals or groups who lack social power or who already face marginalization and discrimination, potentially reinforcing existing prejudices and contributing to further marginalization through the amplification of negative stereotypes or the normalization of discriminatory attitudes. The moral implications of punching down are significantly more complex and problematic, as such humor can cause real harm to vulnerable populations while providing entertainment for those in positions of relative privilege. South Park's handling of this distinction reveals both the sophistication of its creators' understanding and the inevitable contradictions that arise when attempting to maintain consistent ethical standards across hundreds of quote episodes dealing with diverse subject matter, episodes that mock religious fundamentalism or political extremism often represent clear examples of punching up, using humor to challenge ideologies and institutions that wield considerable social influence. However, episodes that feature racial stereotypes or mock specific cultural groups navigate more problematic territory, where the line between legitimate cultural criticism and harmful prejudice reinforcement becomes increasingly blurred. The role of satirical intent in determining the ethical dimensions of offensive humor creates additional layers of complexity in evaluating South Park's controversial moments. Satire, in its purest form, uses exaggeration, irony, and ridicule to expose and criticize human folly, vice, or shortcomings, serving an ultimately constructive purpose by encouraging reflection and potential reform. However, the distinction between genuine satirical intent and simple shock value or attention-seeking behavior is often difficult to discern, particularly when the satirical targets are individuals or groups who may lack the cultural power to defend themselves effectively. The creator's stated intentions, while relevant to understanding their work, cannot serve as the sole determinant of ethical evaluation, as the impact of offensive humor often extends far beyond the creator's conscious goals or anticipated consequences. Jokes that may be intended as harmless entertainment or social commentary can reinforce harmful stereotypes, normalize discriminatory attitudes, or provide ammunition for those seeking to justify prejudice or discrimination against targeted groups. The cultural context within which offensive humor operates plays a crucial role in determining both its reception and its ultimate social impact. Jokes that might be considered relatively harmless within one cultural moment can become deeply problematic as social awareness evolves and previously marginalized voices gain prominence in public discourse. South Park's 25-year run provides a unique window into this evolutionary process, as episodes that were considered edgy but acceptable at the time of their creation may now be viewed as crossing ethical boundaries that contemporary audiences recognize as important and necessary. The temporal dimension of offensive humor reveals how comedy both reflects and shapes cultural attitudes, serving simultaneously as a mirror of existing prejudices and a potential catalyst for changing social norms. Early South Park episodes that featured casual homophobia or transphobia, for example, can be understood both as products of their time and as contributors to the cultural environment that made such attitudes seem acceptable or humorous to mainstream audiences. The evolution of audience sensitivity and cultural awareness creates ongoing challenges for creators of controversial content, as material that was once considered acceptable may be re-evaluated through contemporary moral frameworks that recognize previously ignored forms of harm or discrimination. This evolutionary process raises complex questions about the responsibility of creators to anticipate future social developments and the fairness of judging past work by standards that did not exist at the time of its creation. The psychological appeal of offensive humor operates through several distinct mechanisms that reveal both the constructive and destructive potential of transgressive comedy. For many audience members, jokes that violate social taboos provide a sense of rebellious satisfaction, allowing them to vicariously experience the thrill of transgression, while maintaining the safety of plausible deniability through the comedic frame. This psychological release can serve healthy functions by providing outlets for socially unacceptable thoughts and feelings, but it can also normalize harmful attitudes by making them seem acceptable when expressed in comedic contexts. The social bonding function of offensive humor creates additional complications in evaluating its ethical dimensions. Shared laughter at taboo subjects can create powerful feelings of intimacy and belonging among audience members who feel that they are part of an exclusive group willing to engage with forbidden material. However, this bonding often occurs through the exclusion or dehumanization of the groups or individuals who serve as the targets of the offensive humor, creating in-group solidarity at the expense of out-group dignity and belonging. The cognitive dissonance that offensive humor can create in audiences serves both constructive and destructive purposes depending on how it is resolved. When confronted with jokes that challenge their assumptions or force them to examine uncomfortable truths about themselves or their society, audience members may experience genuine growth and increased self-awareness. Alternatively, they may resolve the dissonance by dismissing the targets of the humor as deserving of ridicule, or by compartmentalizing their entertainment consumption as separate from their moral beliefs and values. The institutional context within which South Park operates as a commercial entertainment product creates additional ethical considerations that complicate simple evaluations of its controversial content. The show's existence within a profit-driven entertainment industry means that controversial content serves commercial as well as artistic purposes, potentially creating incentives for transgression that may not align with genuine satirical or social commentary goals. The economic rewards that flow from controversy and offense can create pressure to push boundaries primarily for attention and ratings rather than for legitimate artistic or social purposes. The responsibility that comes with the platform and influence that South Park has achieved raises questions about the obligations that successful creators bear toward their audiences and society more broadly. With millions of viewers and significant cultural influence, the show's portrayal of different groups and issues carries weight that extends far beyond simple entertainment, potentially shaping public attitudes and discourse in ways that have real-world consequences for the individuals and communities depicted in its episodes. The international dimension of South Park's reach creates additional complexity in evaluating its controversial content, as jokes that may be considered acceptable within American cultural contexts can cause significant offense or harm when viewed by international audiences with different cultural values and sensitivities. The global distribution of American entertainment content means that locally produced satirical commentary becomes part of worldwide cultural discourse, potentially perpetuating American stereotypes and prejudices in international contexts where they may be even more harmful or inappropriate. The educational function that South Park sometimes serves, particularly for younger audience members who may encounter complex social and political issues through the show before encountering them in more traditional educational contexts, creates additional responsibilities for creators to consider the potential impact of their satirical choices. Episodes that mock historical events, political processes, or social movements may shape viewers' understanding of these subjects in ways that persist long after the immediate entertainment value has faded. The paradox of offensive humor's simultaneous potential for harm and healing reflects broader tensions within democratic societies about the proper balance between freedom of expression and protection from discrimination or harassment. South Park's controversial episodes serve as ongoing test cases for these fundamental questions about the limits of acceptable discourse and the responsibilities that accompany communicative freedom. The metacognitive awareness that South Park often demonstrates about its own controversial nature, including episodes that explicitly examine the ethics and consequences of offensive humor, reveals a level of self-reflection that distinguishes it from entertainment that simply seeks to shock or offend without deeper consideration of the implications. These moments of self-examination suggest that the creators possess sophisticated understanding of the ethical dimensions of their work, even when they choose to proceed with potentially problematic content. The legacy of South Park's controversial moments will likely be determined not only by their immediate entertainment value or satirical effectiveness, but by their long-term impact on cultural discourse and social attitudes. Episodes that contribute to greater understanding, empathy, and social progress may be remembered as valuable contributions to important conversations, while those that primarily reinforce harmful stereotypes or normalize discrimination may be viewed as regrettable missteps in an otherwise innovative and influential body of work. The ongoing debate about the proper limits and functions of offensive humor in contemporary society ensures that South Park's controversial episodes will remain subjects of analysis and discussion long after their initial broadcast. These debates serve valuable functions by forcing communities to examine their values, consider the impact of their entertainment choices, and grapple with the complex relationships between freedom, responsibility, and social harm. In the quiet contemplation of comedy's darkest edges, we recognize that the most offensive jokes often reveal as much about their audiences as they do about their creators, serving as uncomfortable mirrors that reflect our collective anxieties, prejudices, and moral blind spots. The greatest achievement of South Park's controversial moments may not be their immediate comedic impact, but their contribution to ongoing conversations about the power of representation, the responsibilities of creators, and the complex ways that entertainment shapes and reflects the societies that produce and consume it. In the sacred landscape of human spiritual experience, where faith intersects with doubt and devotion encounters skepticism, few territories prove as treacherous for comedic exploration as religious belief and practice. South Park's ventures into religious satire represent some of its most philosophically complex and culturally inflammatory moments, revealing the intricate dynamics that govern how societies protect their most cherished beliefs, while simultaneously subjecting them to the scrutiny that democratic discourse requires. The show's treatment of various faith traditions demonstrates both the profound power of religious humor to illuminate hypocrisy and contradiction, and its equally profound capacity to wound believers whose spiritual lives provide meaning, comfort, and community in ways that transcend rational analysis. The Mormon episode, All About Mormons, serves as perhaps the most sophisticated example of South Park's approach to religious commentary, demonstrating how factual, accuracy, and satirical intent can coexist in ways that create both illumination and offense simultaneously. The episode's recounting of Joseph Smith's founding experiences with The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints adheres closely to historical accounts accepted by both believers and academic scholars, presenting the basic narrative elements without significant distortion or fabrication. However, the framing of these events through a deliberately mocking tone and the visual presentation of Smith's encounters with divine messengers transforms historically accurate information into satirical commentary that many Mormon viewers found deeply offensive and hurtful. The psychological complexity underlying this approach reveals the sophisticated understanding that Stone and Parker possess regarding the relationship between belief and evidence in religious contexts. By presenting the factual elements of Mormon founding narratives in a tone that suggests skepticism and incredulity, the episode forces viewers to confront the cognitive dissonance that many people experience when encountering religious claims that require faith rather than empirical verification. The repeated refrain of "why would he make that up?" serves simultaneously as a legitimate question about the motivations underlying religious testimony and as an implicit challenge to the rational foundations of faith-based belief systems. The character of Gary, the Mormon boy whose family welcomes Stan into their home and religious community, embodies the genuine kindness and family values that often characterize religious communities, while also serving as a vehicle for exploring the intellectual tensions that arise when good people hold beliefs that others find difficult to accept. Gary's essential goodness and the warmth of his family create emotional complexity that prevents viewers from dismissing Mormon believers as simply deluded or foolish, while simultaneously maintaining the satirical framework that questions the rational basis of their religious convictions. The episode's conclusion, where Gary delivers an impassioned defense of his faith that acknowledges its potential implausibility while asserting its positive impact on his life and family, represents one of the most nuanced treatments of religious belief in the show's entire run. This moment demonstrates the creator's ability to maintain satirical distance while also recognizing the genuine value that religious practice can provide to believers, creating space for both skepticism and respect within the same narrative framework. The Virgin Mary statue controversy in Bloody Mary reveals different dimensions of religious sensitivity, focusing specifically on Catholic devotional practices and the theological significance of miraculous manifestations within that tradition. The episode's central premise, involving a statue of the Virgin Mary that begins to bleed, draws upon actual reported phenomena within Catholic history, while placing these events within the specific context of Randy Marsh's struggle with alcoholism and his court-mandated attendance at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. The theological implications of the bleeding statue extend far beyond simple shock value to engage with fundamental questions about divine intervention, miraculous healing, and the relationship between faith and recovery that characterize many addiction treatment programs. Randy's desperate hope that the statue might cure his perceived alcoholism reflects genuine human longing for supernatural assistance with problems that seem beyond individual willpower to resolve, while also raising questions about the difference between genuine spiritual experience and wishful thinking or psychological projection. The Catholic community's reaction to the episode's portrayal of Marian devotion reveals the deep emotional and spiritual investment that believers place in religious symbols and practices that may appear arbitrary or even absurd to non-believers. The Virgin Mary occupies a particularly sacred position within Catholic theology and popular devotion, serving not only as the Mother of Jesus, but as an intercessor and source of comfort for millions of believers throughout history. The show's decision to use this figure as the center of satirical commentary struck many Catholic viewers as crossing lines of respect that should govern discussions of their most cherished religious symbols. The episode's ultimate revelation that the bleeding was caused by natural rather than supernatural causes provides satirical commentary on both the human tendency to interpret unusual events through religious frameworks and the patient, institutional responses that often develop around reported miracles. The disappointment and disillusionment that follow the debunking of the miraculous claims reflect genuine psychological processes that occur when deeply held hopes for divine intervention encounter rational explanation or scientific debunking. The Muhammad cartoon controversy that emerged across multiple South Park episodes represents perhaps the most dangerous intersection of religious satire with contemporary political and cultural tensions, revealing how comedy can become entangled with issues of free speech, religious tolerance, international relations, and physical safety in ways that transform entertainment into potential flashpoints for real-world conflict and violence. The initial premise, involving Family Guy's fictional decision to air uncensored images of the Prophet Muhammad, allowed South Park to explore the complex dynamics surrounding religious imagery taboos while maintaining some distance through the fictional framing device. However, The subsequent decision by Comedy Central to censor portions of the episodes and the real-world threats that emerged from various extremist groups demonstrated how satirical commentary about religious sensitivity could itself become a subject of religious and political controversy. The theological significance of image prohibition within Islamic tradition reflects deep historical and doctrinal concerns about idolatry and the proper relationship between human beings and divine reality. The prohibition against depicting the Prophet Muhammad serves not merely as arbitrary religious rule, but as part of a comprehensive theological framework designed to prevent the worship of created beings rather than the Creator, and to maintain appropriate reverence for prophetic authority. Understanding this context is crucial for evaluating the ethical dimensions of the satirical commentary, as the offense experienced by Muslim viewers stems not from simple oversensitivity, but from genuine theological conviction about proper religious practice. The escalation of controversy surrounding these episodes reveals how contemporary geopolitical tensions can transform religious humor from local entertainment into international incidents with potential consequences for diplomatic relations, community safety, and individual security. The death threats directed at Stone and Parker, while representing extreme and unjustifiable responses to satirical content, also demonstrate how religious commentary can become entangled with broader political conflicts and cultural misunderstandings that extend far beyond the immediate scope of comedic entertainment. The Christian rock parody in Christian Rock Hard provides satirical commentary on the commercialization of religious expression and the ways that spiritual content can be co-opted for secular purposes, such as profit generation and cultural influence. Cartman's cynical scheme to achieve platinum album sales by targeting the Christian music market reveals both the genuine spiritual hunger that creates demand for religious entertainment and the potential for exploitation that exists when commercial interests intersect with faith communities. The episode's exploration of the semantic differences between religious and secular expressions of love and devotion demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how language and imagery can be repurposed across different contexts while maintaining surface similarity but fundamental difference in meaning and intent. The jokes that emerge from recontextualizing romantic songs as spiritual devotionals illuminate the thin lines that sometimes separate sacred and secular expressions of deep feeling and commitment. The psychological impact of the episode on genuine Christian rock musicians and their audiences reflects the broader challenges that religious artists face in maintaining authenticity and spiritual integrity while participating in commercial entertainment industries that may prioritize profit over genuine spiritual expression. The satirical commentary raises legitimate questions about the potential corruption of religious message when it becomes packaged and marketed as consumer entertainment product. The Scientology episode Trapped in the Closet represents one of the most comprehensive satirical attacks on a specific religious organization in the show's history, combining detailed critique of Scientology doctrine and practice with broader commentary about celebrity culture, religious authority, and the legal and economic power that some religious organizations wield to protect themselves from criticism and scrutiny. The episode's presentation of core Scientology beliefs regarding alien civilizations, galactic confederations, and the origins of human spiritual problems adheres closely to internal church documents while framing these teachings in ways that emphasize their apparent implausibility and science fiction origins. This approach creates satirical impact by allowing the religious teachings to speak for themselves, while providing context that encourages skeptical evaluation rather than accepting belief. The legal and economic pressure that the Church of Scientology brought to bear in response to the episode demonstrates how religious organizations can use secular power to suppress criticism and control public discourse about their beliefs and practices. The threats of litigation and economic retaliation that followed the episode's broadcast reveal how religious freedom can be weaponized to protect institutions from legitimate scrutiny while simultaneously limiting the expressive freedom of critics and satirists. The celebrity dimension of Scientology, particularly Tom Cruise's prominent role within the organization, provides additional layers of satirical opportunity by combining religious commentary with celebrity culture critique. The portrayal of Cruise's relationship with Scientology illuminates broader questions about how fame, wealth, and social influence intersect with religious authority and spiritual seeking in contemporary culture. The psychological appeal of Scientology's systematic approach to spiritual development and personal improvement reflects genuine human needs for meaning, community, and personal growth that can be exploited by organizations that promise exclusive access to spiritual advancement and insider knowledge about the nature of reality. The satirical commentary raises important questions about the difference between legitimate spiritual guidance and manipulative control systems that use religious language to justify authoritarian practices. The broader pattern of religious satirical content throughout South Park's run reveals consistent themes and concerns that transcend specific denominational boundaries to engage with fundamental questions about faith, reason, community, and authority that characterize religious experience across diverse traditions. The show's willingness to examine religious hypocrisy, institutional corruption, and the gap between spiritual ideals and human practice serves valuable social functions by encouraging critical evaluation of religious claims and practices. However, the psychological impact of religious satirical content on believing communities raises ethical questions about the responsibilities that creators bear when their entertainment choices cause genuine, spiritual, and emotional harm to individuals whose religious practices provide meaning, comfort, and community connection. The pain experienced by religious viewers when their sacred beliefs become subjects of ridicule reflects not simple oversensitivity, but genuine spiritual investment in traditions and practices that shape their understanding of ultimate reality and moral obligation. The educational function that religious satirical episodes sometimes serve, particularly for viewers who may have limited exposure to diverse religious traditions, creates additional responsibilities for creators to balance satirical intent with factual accuracy and fair representation. Episodes that introduce viewers to unfamiliar religious traditions through satirical frameworks may shape lasting impressions and attitudes that influence future interfaith understanding and cooperation. The temporal dimension of religious satirical content reveals how changing cultural attitudes toward religious authority and institutional power affect the reception and interpretation of comedic commentary. Episodes that seemed boldly transgressive when originally broadcast may appear relatively mild as social attitudes evolve, while others may seem increasingly problematic as awareness of religious discrimination and minority rights expands. The international implications of American religious satirical content distributed globally through streaming and broadcast platforms create complex cultural dynamics where locally produced commentary becomes part of worldwide religious discourse. The potential for American satirical perspectives on religion to influence international attitudes towards specific faith traditions raises questions about cultural imperialism and the responsible use of global media platforms. The psychological mechanisms underlying religious humor reveal both its constructive potential for encouraging critical thinking and spiritual growth, and its destructive capacity to reinforce prejudice and undermine the genuine spiritual seeking that characterizes many religious practitioners. The difference between satirical commentary that encourages reflection and growth versus humor that simply mocks and diminishes reflects broader questions about the proper role of criticism in spiritual and moral development. The community impact of religious satirical content extends beyond individual viewers to affect interfaith relations, religious tolerance, and the broader cultural climate within which diverse religious communities must coexist and cooperate. Episodes that reinforce negative stereotypes about specific religious traditions may contribute to discrimination and prejudice that have real-world consequences for religious minorities and their ability to participate fully in democratic societies. The theological sophistication that some religious satirical episodes demonstrate suggests that effective religious comedy requires deep understanding of the traditions being satirized rather than superficial knowledge or casual dismissal. The most successful religious satirical content often emerges from intimate familiarity with religious practice and genuine engagement with theological questions, rather than external mockery of unfamiliar beliefs and customs. In the contemplative silence that follows our examination of faith under comedic scrutiny, we recognize that religious satirical content serves as a mirror reflecting both the genuine spiritual hunger that characterizes human experience and the all-too-human failings that affect religious institutions and practitioners. The finest religious humor illuminates the gap between spiritual ideals and practical implementation, while maintaining respect for the genuine seeking that motivates religious practice, creating space for both laughter and reverence within the complex landscape of human spiritual experience. In the treacherous landscape of racial humor, where the boundaries between social commentary and harmful stereotype blur into barely perceptible distinctions, South Park has ventured repeatedly into territory that exposes the deepest fissures in American racial consciousness, while simultaneously risking the perpetuation of the very prejudices it often seeks to critique. The show's exploration of racial themes reveals both the potential for comedy to illuminate uncomfortable truths about prejudice and discrimination, and its equally profound capacity to reinforce harmful narratives that contribute to the marginalization and dehumanization of communities that continue to struggle for full recognition of their dignity and worth within American society. The People Who Annoy You episode stands as perhaps the most psychologically complex and morally ambiguous examination of racial language and consciousness in contemporary television, creating a scenario that forces both characters and viewers to confront the ways that racial slurs operate within American cultural discourse, while simultaneously demonstrating how easily well-intentioned individuals can become complicit in systems of linguistic oppression. Randy Marsh's appearance on Wheel of Fortune, where he must guess the phrase naggers, but instead utters the most inflammatory racial epithet in American English, creates a moment of excruciating discomfort that serves multiple satirical and educational functions simultaneously. The psychological realism of Randy's mistake reflects the uncomfortable truth that racial slurs remain embedded within American cultural consciousness, even among individuals who would never consciously choose to use such language in their daily interactions. The cognitive slip that leads to his public utterance of the forbidden word reveals how deeply these linguistic patterns of racism have penetrated American society, existing as unconscious possibilities even within the minds of people who consider themselves racially progressive and tolerant. The aftermath of Randy's mistake, where he becomes a pariah within his community, despite his obvious mortification and sincere regret, provides satirical commentary on both the appropriate social consequences for racist expression and the potential for public shaming, to become divorced from genuine understanding or meaningful change. The episode's exploration of how racist language affects both speakers and listeners demonstrates sophisticated awareness of the psychological trauma that such words can inflict, while also examining the complex social dynamics that govern forgiveness, redemption, and community healing after incidents of racial harm. The resolution of the episode, involving Randy's interaction with Jesse Jackson and the broader community conversation about racial language and understanding, attempts to provide constructive framework for processing racial mistakes while acknowledging that some forms of linguistic harm cannot be easily repaired through simple apologies or good intentions. The episode's ultimate message, that white Americans cannot fully understand the impact of racial slurs regardless of their intentions or regret, represents unusually sophisticated racial commentary for mainstream entertainment television. However, the very premise of the episode, which requires the repeated utterance of racial slurs for comedic and dramatic effect, raises complex questions about the ethics of using harmful language in satirical contexts, even when the ultimate message condemns such usage. The potential for audiences to focus on the shock value of the forbidden word, rather than the deeper commentary about racial consciousness, creates risks that the educational intent may be overwhelmed by the visceral impact of hearing taboo language spoken aloud. The development of Token Black's character throughout the series provides another lens through which to examine South Park's complicated relationship with racial representation and stereotype. Token's very name reflects the creator's awareness of tokenism in media representation, while simultaneously participating in the phenomenon by creating a character whose primary function often seems to be providing racial diversity, rather than serving as a fully realized individual with complex motivations and authentic psychological depth. The episodes that explore Token's relationship with his identity as one of the few black students in South Park reveal both genuine insight into the psychological pressures faced by racial minorities in predominantly white communities, and troubling assumptions about black cultural authenticity and behavior. The recurring jokes about Token's supposed natural abilities in basketball and music, his family's assumed economic status, and his relationship to various aspects of black cultural expression demonstrate how even well-intentioned attempts at racial inclusion can perpetuate harmful stereotypes. The bass guitar incident in Christian Rock Hard represents one of the most problematic examples of racial stereotyping in the show's catalog, where Cartman's assumption that Token must naturally possess musical ability because of his race proves correct, despite Token having no previous experience with the instrument. This moment encapsulates the complex dynamics of racial stereotype in entertainment, where seemingly positive assumptions about racial groups can reinforce essentialist thinking that denies individual agency and reduces complex human beings to simple racial categories. The psychological impact of such representation on both black viewers and non-black audiences reveals the serious consequences that can flow from comedic choices that treat racial identity as a source of humor rather than as a fundamental aspect of human dignity deserving of respect and nuanced portrayal. The reinforcement of stereotypes through comedic repetition can shape attitudes and expectations in ways that affect real-world interactions and opportunities for racial minorities. The Here Comes the Neighborhood episode provides perhaps the most sustained examination of residential segregation and economic discrimination in American communities, using the arrival of wealthy black families in South Park as a catalyst for exploring how racial and economic anxieties intersect in complex ways that often mask racist motivations behind seemingly race-neutral concerns about property, values, cultural change, and community character. The episode's central conceit, where long-time residents claim their opposition to the new neighbors stems from economic rather than racial factors, reflects real-world patterns of racial exclusion that operate through coded language and indirect mechanisms that maintain plausible deniability while achieving discriminatory outcomes. The characters' insistence that they welcome diversity while simultaneously working to drive away black families reveals the cognitive dissonance that characterizes much contemporary racial prejudice. The visual imagery of residents dressing as ghosts to intimidate the new families creates deliberate parallels to historical Ku Klux Klan tactics, while allowing characters to maintain that their actions are economically rather than racially motivated. This satirical choice illuminates how contemporary discrimination often employs historical tactics while denying historical connections, creating a form of willful blindness that allows prejudice to persist while avoiding conscious acknowledgement of racist intent. The episode's resolution, where the economic motivations are revealed to be pretense covering deeper racial anxieties, provides commentary on how economic arguments are often weaponized to justify discrimination while avoiding direct engagement with underlying prejudices. However, the comedic framing of these serious issues raises questions about whether satirical treatment adequately conveys the genuine harm caused by residential segregation and economic discrimination. Cartman's repeated appearances in Hitler costumes and Nazi regalia represent some of the most disturbing visual imagery in the show's history, combining racial and religious hatred with historical genocide in ways that risk normalizing extremist symbolism while attempting to provide satirical commentary on the persistence of fascist ideology in contemporary American culture. The episodes featuring these costumes reveal both the creators' awareness of how easily democratic societies can slip toward authoritarian thinking and their willingness to employ shocking imagery to make these points. The first Hitler costume appearance, during a Halloween episode where Principal Victoria attempts to modify the outfit into something more appropriate, provides satirical commentary on how institutional authorities often respond to expressions of extremist ideology through cosmetic changes rather than direct confrontation of underlying problems. The transformation of the Hitler costume into what resembles Ku Klux Klan regalia creates visual commentary on the connections between different forms of racial hatred, while simultaneously demonstrating how attempts to moderate extremist expression can inadvertently create equally problematic alternatives. The second Hitler costume incident, involving Cartman's leadership of a Mel Gibson fan club, explores how celebrity worship and popular culture can become vehicles for extremist recruitment and ideology transmission. The club members' gradual adoption of Nazi-like behaviors and rhetoric while remaining unaware of the historical parallels they are enacting provides satirical commentary on how fascist movements often gain support from individuals who would consciously reject extremist ideologies if they were presented directly rather than through cultural and entertainment channels. The psychological realism of the fan club members' transformation reveals sophisticated understanding of how extremist movements operate through gradual escalation and social conformity rather than sudden conversion to explicitly hateful ideologies. The characters' willingness to participate in increasingly disturbing activities while maintaining their fundamental innocence and ignorance reflects real-world patterns of extremist recruitment that prey on social belonging, needs, and gradual normalization of harmful behaviors. However, the use of Nazi imagery and ideology for comedic purposes, even when intended to satirize and condemn extremist thinking, raises serious ethical questions about the appropriateness of employing symbols of genocide and racial hatred as entertainment content. The potential for such imagery to traumatize viewers, normalize extremist symbols, or provide ammunition for actual extremist groups creates risks that may outweigh the satirical and educational benefits intended by the creators. The Cartman Shoots Token incident represents perhaps the most direct engagement with contemporary police violence and racial injustice issues, using the framework of zombie apocalypse parody to explore how racial bias affects perceptions of threat and justifications for violence. The episode's combination of World War Z satire with commentary on the Trayvon Martin case creates complex narrative territory where horror movie tropes intersect with real-world racial trauma in potentially problematic ways. The psychological dynamics underlying Cartman's decision to shoot Token, including his perception of threat and his subsequent legal justification, provide satirical commentary on how racial bias operates in split-second decision-making situations, while simultaneously risking the trivialization of genuine police violence issues through comedic framing. The episode's exploration of legal and social responses to racial violence attempts to illuminate systemic problems, while potentially minimizing the real trauma experienced by communities affected by police violence. The aftermath of the shooting, where Cartman faces no meaningful consequences and Token recovers without lasting impact, creates a sanitized version of racial violence that may fail to convey the genuine severity of police brutality and its effects on Black communities. The comedic resolution, while maintaining the show's typical avoidance of permanent character damage, potentially undermines the serious commentary about racial injustice by suggesting that such violence lacks lasting consequences. The broader pattern of racial representation throughout South Park's run reveals consistent themes and blind spots that reflect both the creators' genuine attempts to engage with racial issues and their limitations as white creators working within predominantly white creative environments. The show's tendency to approach racial topics through the perspectives of white characters, even when attempting to provide commentary on racism and discrimination, creates structural limitations that affect the authenticity and effectiveness of its racial commentary. The psychological impact of South Park's racial content on viewers from different racial backgrounds reveals the complex ways that satirical representation can simultaneously educate and harm, depending on audience perspective and social position. White viewers may experience the show's racial content as eye-opening commentary that increases their awareness of racial issues, while viewers of color may experience the same content as reinforcement of harmful stereotypes or trivialization of their experiences of discrimination and prejudice. The educational function that some racial episodes serve, particularly for viewers with limited exposure to discussions of racism and discrimination, creates both opportunities and responsibilities for creators to balance satirical intent with accurate information and respectful treatment of serious social issues. The potential for entertainment media to shape attitudes and understanding about racial issues means that comedic choices carry weight beyond immediate entertainment value. The international dimension of South Park's racial content creates additional complexity as American racial dynamics and historical contexts become part of global cultural discourse through media distribution. Jokes and references that may be understood within American racial contexts can be misinterpreted or cause harm when viewed by international audiences with different racial histories and cultural frameworks. The temporal evolution of racial sensitivity and awareness means that episodes considered acceptable at the time of their creation may be re-evaluated as understanding of racial harm and discrimination develops. The show's early episodes, created during periods of less racial awareness, may contain content that would not be acceptable by contemporary standards, while still reflecting the cultural attitudes prevalent at the time of their production. The commercial incentives that shape television production create additional pressures around racial content, as controversy and offense can generate publicity and audience engagement that serve economic interests regardless of their social impact. The potential for racial humor to be exploited for commercial gain, rather than serving genuine satirical or educational purposes, raises questions about the motivations underlying controversial racial content. The psychological mechanisms underlying racial humor reveal both its potential for challenging prejudice through exposure and ridicule of racist thinking, and its capacity to reinforce racial hierarchies through the normalization of discriminatory attitudes and stereotypes. The difference between humor that genuinely challenges racism versus humor that perpetuates it often depends on subtle factors of framing, context, and audience interpretation that can be difficult to control or predict. The community impact of racial satirical content extends beyond individual entertainment to influence broader cultural conversations about race, identity, and discrimination in ways that can either promote understanding and progress or reinforce division and prejudice. The responsibility that creators bear for these broader social impacts remains a subject of ongoing debate within entertainment industries and academic communities studying media representation. In the quiet reflection that follows our examination of comedy's engagement with racial consciousness, we recognize that humor's power to both heal and harm racial divisions reflects broader tensions within American society about how to acknowledge historical injustices while building more inclusive and equitable communities. The most effective racial humor emerges from genuine understanding and respect for the experiences of all racial communities, creating space for both honest examination of racial problems and recognition of shared humanity across racial lines. In the complex cartography of international humor, where cultural understanding collides with national stereotypes and global awareness wrestles with provincial prejudice, South Park's treatment of foreign nations and their inhabitants reveals both the provincial limitations of American cultural perspective and the universal human tendency to reduce complex societies into simplified caricatures that serve domestic entertainment needs rather than genuine, cross-cultural understanding. The show's sustained mockery of various national cultures demonstrates how comedy can simultaneously expose American ignorance about the wider world while perpetuating the very stereotypes and misconceptions that contribute to international misunderstanding and cultural insensitivity. The relentless satirical assault on Canada and Canadian culture represents perhaps the longest-running and most comprehensive example of national stereotyping in contemporary television, transforming America's peaceful northern neighbor into a source of continuous comedic material through the systematic exaggeration and distortion of perceived cultural differences. The Canadian character's distinctive visual design, featuring horizontally split heads that flap open and closed during speech, creates an immediately recognizable visual shorthand for Canadian identity, while simultaneously reducing an entire nation to a simple animation gimmick that prioritizes comedic convenience over respectful representation. The linguistic choices that characterize South Park's Canadian characters reveal both genuine observation of regional speech patterns and deliberate exaggeration designed to create comedic effect through cultural mockery. The emphasis on certain vowel sounds, the insertion of into conversational patterns, and the stereotypical politeness that defines Canadian dialogue demonstrates awareness of actual cultural characteristics while amplifying these traits to levels that border on cruel parody rather than gentle satirical observation. The recurring conflicts between the United States and Canada within the show's narrative framework, culminating in the full-scale war depicted in the South Park movie, provides satirical commentary on how minor cultural differences can be weaponized into major international tensions when filtered through media sensationalism and political opportunism. The absurdity of going to war over cultural and entertainment differences serves as metaphor for how easily democratic nations can be manipulated into conflict through appeals to cultural superiority and national pride. However, the sustained nature of anti-Canadian humor throughout the series creates cumulative effects that extend beyond individual episode commentary to encompass a broader pattern of cultural dismissal that may influence American attitudes toward their northern neighbors in ways that affect real, diplomatic and cultural relationships. The psychological impact of constant exposure to stereotypical representations can shape perceptions and expectations even among viewers who consciously recognize the satirical nature of the content. The political dimensions of Canadian representation within South Park reveal American anxieties about national identity and cultural distinctiveness that manifest through the need to define American characteristics in opposition to perceived Canadian traits. The portrayal of Canadians as excessively polite, conflict avoidant, and culturally homogeneous serves to reinforce American self-perception as more dynamic, assertive, and culturally diverse, creating national identity through contrast rather than positive definition. The economic undertones that occasionally surface in Canadian-focused episodes reflect broader American concerns about economic competition and resource distribution in North American contexts, where Canada's natural resource wealth and social welfare systems sometimes serve as implicit critiques of American domestic policies. The satirical treatment of Canadian social programs and healthcare systems provides commentary on American domestic political debates while maintaining enough distance through international framing to avoid direct political confrontation. The Japanese representation in episodes like Shin Pokemon demonstrates how South Park's cultural satirical approach operates when dealing with nations that occupy more complex positions within American cultural consciousness, combining elements of respect for technological advancement with anxiety about cultural influence and economic competition. The episode's portrayal of Japanese characters as simultaneously sophisticated and devious reflects broader American ambivalence about Japan's role as both ally and economic rival in contemporary global politics. The historical dimension of Japanese representation within the episode draws upon World War II-era propaganda imagery and rhetoric, while transplanting these themes into contemporary contexts involving children's entertainment and consumer culture. The suggestion that Japanese corporations might use popular culture products to influence American children for geopolitical purposes reflects genuine concerns about cultural imperialism, while employing satirical exaggeration to explore these themes through comedic rather than purely analytical frameworks. The linguistic stereotyping that characterizes Japanese characters, including exaggerated accent patterns and specific speech impediments, demonstrates how pronunciation differences can be weaponized for comedic purposes in ways that may reinforce cultural hierarchies and linguistic prejudices. The reduction of Japanese speech patterns to simple comedic formulas fails to acknowledge the complexity and sophistication of Japanese language, while potentially reinforcing American assumptions about linguistic superiority and cultural sophistication. The sexual content that occasionally appears in Japanese-focused episodes, including references to anatomical stereotypes and sexual practices, crosses lines that transform cultural commentary into personal and physical mockery that serves no apparent satirical purpose beyond shock value and adolescent humor. These elements reveal the limitations of cultural satirical approaches that prioritize immediate comedic impact over respectful engagement with cultural differences and human dignity. The Chinese representation throughout various South Park episodes reflects the evolving nature of American-Chinese relations and the complex mixture of economic dependence, political tension, and cultural misunderstanding that characterizes contemporary interactions between these two global powers. The show's treatment of Chinese characters and culture demonstrates how geopolitical anxieties can be processed through entertainment media in ways that both illuminate and distort actual international relationships. The restaurant infiltration episode featuring Cartman's attempted disguise as Chinese provides satirical commentary on American ignorance about Asian cultures, while simultaneously perpetuating the very stereotypes and misconceptions it appears to mock. Cartman's crude attempt at Chinese identity, complete with exaggerated physical modifications and linguistic caricature, serves as obvious satire of American cultural insensitivity, while potentially reinforcing harmful stereotypes about Chinese appearance and behavior. The economic themes that surface in Chinese-focused episodes reflect genuine American concerns about trade relationships, manufacturing competition, and economic dependence that have become increasingly prominent in contemporary political discourse. The satirical treatment of these issues through entertainment frameworks provides accessible entry points for discussing complex economic relationships, while potentially oversimplifying the nuanced realities of international trade and economic cooperation. The political commentary embedded within Chinese representation reveals American anxieties about authoritarian governance, human rights issues, and ideological competition that extend beyond simple cultural differences to encompass fundamental questions about democratic values and international relations. The show's approach to these sensitive topics through comedic frameworks allows exploration of controversial political issues while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct diplomatic consequences. The technological and industrial dimensions of Chinese representation within South Park episodes often focus on manufacturing capabilities, product quality concerns, and intellectual property issues that reflect real American business and consumer anxieties, while potentially reinforcing prejudices about Chinese industrial practices and product reliability. The satirical treatment of these economic realities risks perpetuating harmful generalizations while failing to acknowledge the complexity and sophistication of contemporary Chinese technological and industrial development. The cultural practices that receive satirical attention in Chinese-focused episodes often involve food, family relationships, and social customs that become sources of comedic material through their perceived differences from American norms. The reduction of complex cultural traditions to simple comedic formulas fails to convey the richness and significance of Chinese cultural heritage, while potentially reinforcing American assumptions about cultural superiority and normalcy. The historical context that occasionally appears in Chinese representation includes references to political movements, historical conflicts, and cultural changes that require sophisticated understanding for appropriate satirical treatment. The potential for misrepresenting complex historical events through comedic simplification creates risks of perpetuating historical misconceptions while failing to acknowledge the genuine human costs and cultural significance of major historical transitions. The linguistic elements of Chinese character portrayal, including accent exaggeration and speech pattern mockery, demonstrate how pronunciation differences become sources of comedic material in ways that reinforce linguistic hierarchies and cultural prejudices. The failure to distinguish between different Chinese languages and dialects reveals American ignorance about Chinese linguistic diversity while treating language difference as inherently humorous rather than simply reflecting cultural and regional variation. The broader pattern of international representation throughout South Park's catalog reveals consistent themes of American cultural provincialism combined with genuine curiosity about global relationships and cultural differences. The show's approach to foreign cultures often reflects the limitations of American cultural education and media representation, while attempting to provide satirical commentary on American ignorance and cultural insensitivity. The psychological appeal of cultural mockery for American audiences reveals both healthy impulses toward cultural criticism and problematic tendencies toward cultural supremacy that characterize much American popular entertainment. The laughter generated by foreign cultural practices often stems from relief at American cultural normalcy rather than genuine appreciation for cultural diversity and human creativity across different societies. The educational potential of international satirical content remains largely unrealized due to the prioritization of comedic impact over cultural accuracy and respectful representation. Episodes that could serve as introduction to foreign cultures for American audiences instead often reinforce existing prejudices while failing to convey the complexity and richness of different cultural traditions and contemporary social realities. The diplomatic implications of American entertainment content that ridicules foreign cultures extend beyond immediate comedic impact to affect international relationships and cultural exchange opportunities. The global distribution of American satirical content means that local entertainment choices become part of international cultural discourse in ways that can either promote or hinder cross-cultural understanding and cooperation. The economic dimensions of cultural mockery within commercial entertainment create incentives for controversial international content that generates audience engagement and media attention, regardless of its impact on international relationships or cultural understanding. The commercial success of culturally insensitive content can perpetuate harmful representation patterns while discouraging more thoughtful and respectful approaches to cultural difference and international themes. The temporal evolution of international representation within South Park reflects changing geopolitical relationships and cultural awareness that affect how foreign cultures are perceived and portrayed within American entertainment contexts. Episodes created during different periods of international relations reveal how global political changes influence domestic cultural attitudes and entertainment content production. The community impact of international satirical content extends beyond individual entertainment consumption to influence broader American attitudes toward immigration, international relations, and cultural diversity within domestic contexts. The reinforcement of cultural stereotypes through entertainment media can affect how American communities respond to cultural difference and how they engage with immigrant and international populations. The responsibility that American entertainment creators bear for international cultural representation reflects the global reach and influence of American media production, combined with America's significant role in international, political, and economic relationships. The power that comes with global media influence creates obligations to consider the international impact of domestic entertainment choices and their effects on global cultural understanding. The psychological mechanisms underlying cultural humor reveal both its potential for promoting cultural awareness through exposure to difference and its capacity for reinforcing cultural prejudices through stereotype confirmation and difference mockery. The distinction between humor that genuinely promotes cross-cultural understanding versus humor that simply reinforces existing prejudices often depends on subtle factors of intention, context, and cultural sensitivity that can be difficult to achieve consistently. In the quiet contemplation of how comedy crosses borders and cultures, we recognize that international humor serves as both bridge and barrier in global relationships, capable of promoting understanding through shared laughter, while simultaneously reinforcing divisions through cultural mockery. The highest aspirations of international satirical content involve genuine cultural exchange and mutual understanding, while its lowest expressions perpetuate ignorance and prejudice that hinder the cooperation and respect necessary for peaceful global coexistence. In the delicate ecosystem of human difference, where physical and cognitive variations create both the rich tapestry of human experience and the unfortunate opportunities for exclusion and mockery, few territories prove as morally treacherous for comedic exploration as disability and the systematic marginalization of those whose bodies and minds operate outside the narrow parameters that societies define as normal or acceptable. South Park's ventures into disability-focused humor reveal the complex dynamics that govern how communities respond to difference, demonstrating both comedy's potential to challenge ableist assumptions and normalize inclusion, and its equally profound capacity to reinforce harmful stereotypes that contribute to the continued marginalization of disabled individuals who already face significant barriers to full social participation and recognition of their inherent dignity and worth. The Special Olympics episode Up the Down Steroid stands as perhaps the most morally complex and ethically problematic exploration of disability representation in contemporary television, creating a narrative framework that exposes the depths of ableist thinking, while simultaneously participating in the very forms of discrimination and mockery it appears to critique. Cartman's scheme to compete in the Special Olympics by pretending to have an intellectual disability represents not merely a single character's moral failing, but a comprehensive examination of how disabled individuals are perceived, categorized, and ultimately dehumanized within systems that claim to serve and support them. The psychological realism underlying Cartman's plan reveals sophisticated understanding of how ableist assumptions operate within supposedly inclusive institutions, demonstrating how easily systems designed to provide opportunities for disabled individuals can be manipulated by those who view disability as performance rather than lived experience. His confidence that he can successfully mimic intellectual disability reflects broader social misconceptions about the nature of cognitive difference and the complexity of disabled experience, reducing genuine neurological and developmental variations to simple behavioral patterns that can be copied through superficial observation and crude stereotyping. The elaborate preparation process that Cartman undergoes, including his adoption of what he believes are authentic, disabled mannerisms and speech patterns, provides disturbing insight into how disability is often understood through external observation rather than internal experience, creating caricatures that bear little resemblance to the actual lives and perspectives of disabled individuals. His willingness to undergo physical modifications and behavior changes in service of his deception demonstrates the extent to which disability is viewed as costume or performance rather than fundamental aspect of human identity and experience. The institutional failure represented by Cartman's successful registration for the Special Olympics competition reveals systemic problems within disability services and advocacy organizations that prioritize administrative efficiency over genuine understanding and protection of the communities they claim to serve. The ease with which his mother is able to vouch for his supposed disability without providing substantial documentation or evidence suggests bureaucratic systems that operate through assumption and stereotype rather than careful evaluation and authentic advocacy. The competitive events themselves, where Cartman struggles and ultimately fails despite his assumed advantages over genuinely disabled competitors, provide complex satirical commentary on both the athletic abilities of disabled individuals and the misconceptions that non-disabled people hold about disability and competition. His poor performance challenges assumptions about the relationship between disability and athletic capability, while simultaneously maintaining comedic distance that may prevent genuine recognition of disabled athletic achievement and competitive spirit. The psychological impact of the episode on disabled viewers and their families reveals the serious consequences that flow from entertainment choices that treat disability as source of humor rather than fundamental aspect of human diversity, deserving respect and accurate representation. The potential for such content to reinforce negative stereotypes and contribute to social stigma creates harm that extends far beyond immediate entertainment consumption to affect real-world opportunities and social acceptance for disabled individuals. The character development of Jimmy and Timmy throughout the series provides contrasting examples of how disabled characters can be integrated into mainstream entertainment in ways that acknowledge their disabilities while allowing them to serve functions beyond simple representation or inspiration. Jimmy's career as a comedian who incorporates his speech impediment into his performance demonstrates how disabled individuals can claim agency over their own representation and challenge assumptions about disability and humor through authentic self-expression rather than external. Mozzeri. The complexity of Jimmy's character, including his competitive drive, romantic interests, and moral struggles, creates representation that moves beyond simple inspiration or pity to encompass the full range of human experience and emotion that characterizes disabled lives. His involvement in storylines that do not center on his disability, while acknowledging its impact on his daily experience, provides a model for inclusive representation that neither ignores disability nor reduces characters to their disabled status. Timmy's character presents different challenges and opportunities for disability representation, as his communication limitations create ongoing questions about agency, understanding, and social participation that reflect real-world barriers faced by individuals with significant communication disabilities. The show's approach to Timmy's limited vocabulary and communication style walks a fine line between respectful acknowledgement of communication difference and potential mockery of speech disability. The social dynamics that develop around Jimmy and Timmy's friendship and their interactions with other characters provide insight into how disabled individuals navigate social relationships and community, belonging in environments that may not fully understand or accommodate their needs and perspectives. Their inclusion in group activities and storylines demonstrates both the possibilities for genuine inclusion and the ongoing challenges that arise when disabled individuals participate in communities designed primarily for non-disabled people. The Ginger Kids storyline in Ginger Kids represents one of the most sustained explorations of how arbitrary physical characteristics can be transformed into basis for systematic discrimination and social exclusion, using red hair and freckles as metaphor for broader patterns of prejudice while simultaneously creating genuine harm for individuals who actually possess these physical traits. Cartman's presentation of gingivitis as a disease that affects the soul reveals how pseudoscientific thinking can be employed to justify discrimination and dehumanization of groups based on physical appearance. The escalation of anti-ginger sentiment throughout the episode, including organized persecution and systematic exclusion, provides satirical commentary on how easily communities can be manipulated into adopting discriminatory attitudes toward arbitrary physical characteristics. When those characteristics are framed through medical or spiritual frameworks that suggest fundamental difference or deficiency. The speed with which the South Park community embraces anti-ginger prejudice demonstrates how quickly social norms can shift to accommodate new forms of discrimination when they are presented through authoritative frameworks. The real-world impact of the Ginger Kids episode, including the creation of Kick a Ginger Day and actual harassment of red-haired students, reveals how satirical content can escape its original context to become catalyst for genuine discrimination and violence against the groups it claims to defend through satirical mockery of prejudice. The transformation of anti-prejudice satire into actual prejudice demonstrates the complex and unpredictable ways that entertainment content can influence social behavior and community attitudes. The psychological mechanisms underlying the ginger discrimination storyline reveal how physical difference becomes transformed into social hierarchy through cultural narratives that assign meaning and value to arbitrary biological characteristics. The association of red hair with spiritual deficiency and social undesirability reflects broader patterns of discrimination that operate through the creation of meaningful categories from meaningless biological variation. The ultimate revelation that Cartman himself possesses ginger genetics creates complex satirical commentary on how discrimination often stems from self-hatred and fear of association with stigmatized groups, while also providing comedic resolution that may undermine the serious examination of prejudice and discrimination that the episode initially appears to promote. His greater concern about his own genetic status than about the discrimination he has promoted reveals the narcissistic foundations of much prejudicial thinking. The broader representation of physical difference throughout South Park's catalog demonstrates consistent patterns of using unusual appearance or physical characteristics as sources of comedic material, without necessarily providing deeper commentary on the social dynamics that create stigma around physical variation. Characters with distinctive physical features often serve primarily comedic functions rather than representing genuine exploration of how appearance-based discrimination operates within communities and social institutions. The medical dimensions of disability representation within South Park episodes often focus on treatment procedures, therapeutic interventions, and institutional responses to disability in ways that prioritize comedic potential over accurate representation of disabled experience and medical reality. The portrayal of therapy sessions, medical evaluations, and treatment programs often employs medical settings and procedures as comedic props rather than serious examination of how medical systems serve or fail disabled individuals. The family dynamics that emerge around disabled characters provide insight into how disability affects entire family systems, while sometimes perpetuating stereotypes about family relationships and caregiving responsibilities that may not reflect the diverse realities of families that include disabled members. The representation of parental responses to childhood disability often emphasizes extreme reactions rather than the complex ongoing processes of adaptation and advocacy that characterize many families' experiences. The educational contexts within which disabled characters operate, including their integration into mainstream classrooms and their participation in school activities, provide opportunities for exploring inclusion and accessibility, while sometimes failing to address the systemic barriers and ongoing challenges that affect disabled students' educational experiences. The portrayal of special education services and accommodations often emphasizes their comedic potential rather than their essential role in ensuring educational equity and access. The employment and economic dimensions of disability representation within South Park episodes occasionally touch on issues of workplace accommodation, economic support, and career opportunities for disabled individuals, though these themes often remain secondary to comedic storylines rather than receiving serious examination. The limited exploration of economic challenges facing disabled adults reflects broader societal neglect of disability, economics, and employment equity issues. The intersection of disability with other forms of difference, including race, gender, and economic status, rarely receives sustained attention within South Park's disability-focused content, despite the reality that many disabled individuals experience multiple forms of marginalization simultaneously. The failure to address intersectionality within disability representation limits the accuracy and completeness of disability portrayal, while potentially reinforcing assumptions about disability as singular identity category. The historical context of disability rights and social change rarely appears in South Park's disability-focused episodes, despite the rich history of disability activism and the ongoing struggle for civil rights and social inclusion that shapes contemporary disability experience. The absence of historical awareness limits the depth and accuracy of disability representation while potentially perpetuating assumptions about disability as individual rather than social and political phenomenon. The international dimensions of disability representation and rights remain largely unexplored within South Park's treatment of disability themes, despite significant global variation in disability rights, social attitudes, and support systems that affect disabled individuals' opportunities and experiences across different cultural contexts. The provincialism of American disability representation limits cross-cultural understanding and awareness of global disability issues and experiences. The technological aspects of disability accommodation and assistive technology rarely receive sustained attention within disability-focused episodes, despite the significant role that technology plays in enabling participation and independence for many disabled individuals. The limited exploration of technological solutions and innovations reflects broader societal underestimation of technology's potential for addressing disability-related barriers and enhancing disabled individuals' capabilities and opportunities. The legal and policy dimensions of disability rights, including civil rights protections, accommodation requirements, and anti-discrimination legislation, remain largely absent from South Park's disability representation, despite their crucial role in shaping disabled individuals' access to education, employment, and community participation. The failure to address legal and policy issues limits understanding of systemic factors that affect disability, experience, and social inclusion. In the contemplative silence that follows our examination of difference as entertainment, we recognize that disability representation in popular media serves as both mirror and shaper of social attitudes toward human variation, carrying responsibilities that extend far beyond immediate comedic impact to encompass the ongoing struggle for recognition, respect, and full social inclusion of individuals whose bodies and minds operate outside conventional norms. The finest disability representation emerges from genuine understanding and respect for disabled experience while challenging assumptions and barriers that limit participation and belonging within human communities. In the unforgiving arena of contemporary celebrity culture, where fame transforms human beings into commodities for public consumption and private lives become performance spaces for mass entertainment, few television programs have wielded the power of satirical destruction with the surgical precision and moral complexity demonstrated by South Park's treatment of public figures whose personal struggles, professional failures, and psychological vulnerabilities become raw material for comedic exploration that often crosses the boundary between legitimate cultural criticism and cruel character assassination. The show's approach to celebrity mockery reveals both the democratic impulse to challenge the powerful and privileged, and the troubling tendency to transform human suffering into entertainment content that serves audience bloodlust rather than genuine social commentary or artistic expression. The brutal character assassination of Paris Hilton in Stupid Spoiled Whore video playset represents perhaps the most comprehensive and sustained attack on a single celebrity in South Park's catalogue, transforming a real human being into a symbol of cultural decay while employing levels of vitriol and dehumanization that extend far beyond satirical commentary into territories of genuine cruelty and personal destruction. The episode's portrayal of Hilton as fundamentally worthless, intellectually vacant, and morally corrupting reduces a complex individual to a collection of negative stereotypes and cultural anxieties about wealth, privilege, and female sexuality that reveal as much about societal prejudices as they do about the specific target of satirical attack. The psychological framework underlying the Hilton episode demonstrates how celebrity criticism often operates through projection of broader cultural anxieties onto individual public figures who become scapegoats for problems that extend far beyond their personal choices or public behavior. Hilton's function within the narrative as corrupting influence on young girls reflects genuine concerns about media representation and role models, while channeling these legitimate worries into personal attacks that treat an individual celebrity as responsible for systemic cultural problems that predate and transcend her personal influence. The visual and verbal imagery employed in Hilton's characterization crosses lines that transform satirical commentary into something approaching hate speech, with repeated emphasis on her perceived promiscuity, intellectual limitations, and moral deficiencies that create a portrait of irredeemable human worthlessness rather than flawed celebrity behavior deserving criticism. The decision to literally feed her to Mr. Slave provides graphic imagery that suggests not merely criticism but complete dehumanization and elimination of an individual whose primary crime appears to be achieving fame through methods that the creators find morally objectionable. The cultural impact of the Hilton episode extends beyond immediate entertainment to contribute to broader patterns of public discourse that normalize extreme personal attacks on female celebrities whose behavior or career choices violate traditional expectations about appropriate feminine conduct and moral behavior. The episode's influence on audience attitudes toward Hilton and similar celebrities demonstrates how satirical content can shape public opinion in ways that affect real individuals' psychological well-being and social acceptance. The moral complexity surrounding celebrity satirical attack becomes particularly evident when examining the power dynamics that govern relationships between entertainment creators and their celebrity targets, as the institutional protection and creative freedom enjoyed by satirical creators creates significant imbalances that may transform legitimate criticism into systematic harassment or abuse. The ability of television programs to repeatedly attack individual celebrities while those celebrities lack equivalent platforms for response creates ethical concerns about fairness and proportionality in satirical discourse. The Steve Irwin Hell Party incident represents a different category of celebrity mockery that involves the portrayal of recently deceased public figures in ways that may cause additional grief and trauma to surviving family members and fans who are still processing loss and attempting to honor the deceased individual's memory and contributions. The decision to place Irwin in hell while depicting him with the physical wounds that caused his death creates imagery that serves no apparent satirical or social commentary purpose beyond shock value and poor taste. The temporal dimensions of the Irwin incident occurring shortly after his accidental death while public mourning was still active and intense, demonstrate how satirical content can intersect with genuine grief and trauma in ways that transform entertainment into sources of additional pain for individuals and communities already struggling with loss and bereavement. The failure to allow appropriate mourning periods before subjecting deceased celebrities to satirical treatment reveals insensitivity to basic human needs for dignity and respect in death. The international implications of the Irwin episode become particularly significant, given his status as beloved figure within Australian culture and his role as positive representative of wildlife conservation and environmental siege. Education. The American satirical treatment of an Australian cultural icon shortly after his tragic death creates diplomatic and cultural tensions that extend beyond entertainment to affect international relationships and cultural understanding between allied nations. The response from Irwin's family, particularly his wife's reported distress at the portrayal, demonstrates the real human costs that flow from celebrity satirical content that prioritizes comedic impact over consideration for the emotional well-being of surviving family members who must cope with both personal loss and public mockery of their deceased loved one. The transformation of private grief into public entertainment raises fundamental questions about the ethical boundaries that should govern celebrity representation in satirical media. The broader pattern of deceased celebrity representation within South Park reveals consistent insensitivity to mourning processes and family grief, with multiple instances of recently deceased public figures being subjected to satirical treatment that appears designed more to generate controversy and attention than to provide meaningful commentary on their lives, careers, or cultural impact. This pattern suggests systemic problems with the show's approach to death and celebrity, rather than isolated instances of poor judgment. The Britney Spears episodes provide perhaps the most psychologically complex examination of celebrity mental health crisis and media exploitation, using the framework of literal sacrifice and ritual murder to explore how entertainment industries and media consumption patterns contribute to the psychological destruction of vulnerable public figures whose personal struggles become sources of public entertainment and commercial profit. The metaphor of Spears as sacrificial victim reveals sophisticated understanding of how celebrity culture operates through the systematic exploitation and ultimate destruction of individuals who serve as offerings to public appetite for scandal and tragedy. The ritualistic elements of the Spears storyline, including the involvement of entertainment industry figures in her literal sacrifice, provide disturbing commentary on how commercial interests prioritize profit generation over human well-being while maintaining plausible deniability about their role in celebrity psychological destruction. The episode's suggestion that entertainment industries consciously participate in celebrity destruction for commercial purposes reflects genuine concerns about exploitation while employing supernatural frameworks that may obscure real-world institutional responsibility and complicity. The psychological realism of Spears' portrayed mental state, including her confusion, vulnerability, and desperate attempts to escape public attention, demonstrates awareness of genuine celebrity mental health struggles, while potentially contributing to the very exploitation and dehumanization that the episode appears to critique. The use of real celebrity mental health crisis as source material for satirical entertainment raises ethical questions about consent, privacy, and the responsibilities that creators bear when incorporating actual human suffering into fictional narratives. The cultural commentary embedded within the Spears episodes extends beyond individual celebrity criticism to encompass broader examination of how societies create and consume celebrity suffering as form of mass entertainment that serves psychological functions related to Schadenfreude, moral superiority, and social bonding through shared judgment of public figures. The recognition that celebrity destruction serves audience needs and commercial interests provides valuable insight into celebrity culture while potentially perpetuating the very dynamics it claims to criticize. The aftermath of celebrity mental health representation in entertainment media demonstrates how satirical content can influence public attitudes toward mental illness and recovery in ways that either promote understanding and empathy or reinforce stigma and discrimination against individuals struggling with psychological problems. The treatment of celebrity mental health crisis as comedic material may contribute to broader cultural attitudes that discourage help-seeking and normalize the mockery of mental illness, symptoms, and treatment. The Jared Fogle AIDS wordplay episode represents one of the most prophetically disturbing examples of celebrity satirical treatment, creating comedic content around a public figure who would later be convicted of serious crimes involving child exploitation and abuse. The episode's transformation of AIDS awareness into comedic confusion through linguistic misunderstanding demonstrates how health advocacy and serious social issues can be trivialized through satirical treatment that prioritizes wordplay over genuine engagement with important topics. The retrospective viewing of the Fogle episode following his criminal conviction creates complex interpretive challenges where comedic content becomes entangled with genuine criminal behavior in ways that may suggest either prescient awareness of hidden character flaws or unfortunate coincidence between satirical characterization and subsequent real-world events. The uncomfortable alignment between satirical portrayal and later criminal revelation raises questions about the relationship between public persona and private behavior that extend beyond immediate satirical intent. The ethical implications of creating comedic content around public figures who may be engaged in harmful or criminal behavior while maintaining public facades of respectability demonstrate the complex relationships between entertainment, journalism, and social responsibility that characterize contemporary media landscapes. The potential for satirical content to serve early warning functions about problematic public figures must be balanced against risks of unfair character assassination and the presumption of innocence that should govern treatment of individuals who have not been formally charged or convicted of crimes. The pattern of celebrity scandal prediction within South Park episodes reveals either remarkable intuition about celebrity psychology and behavior patterns, or statistical inevitability given the volume of celebrity satirical content and the frequency of celebrity scandal and downfall in contemporary culture. The ability of satirical content to anticipate celebrity problems may reflect broader social awareness of celebrity, vulnerability, and exploitation, rather than specific insight into individual celebrity behavior and character. The commercial incentives that drive celebrity satirical content create systematic pressures toward increasingly extreme and personal attacks that generate audience engagement and media attention regardless of their accuracy, fairness, or impact on the targeted individuals and their families. The economic rewards that flow from celebrity controversy and scandal create institutional interests in celebrity destruction that may override ethical considerations about human dignity and privacy rights. The legal protections that shield satirical creators from defamation and harassment claims create asymmetrical power relationships where celebrities may lack effective recourse against sustained satirical attack, while creators enjoy broad, creative freedom that extends to potentially harmful, personal characterization, and reputation damage. The balance between creative expression and individual protection remains a contentious area of law and ethics that affects how celebrity satirical content is created and regulated. The psychological impact of sustained satirical attack on celebrity targets reveals the potential for entertainment content to cause genuine harm to public figures, whose emotional well-being and mental health may be affected by constant public mockery and character assassination. The human costs of celebrity satirical content often remain invisible to audiences who consume such content as entertainment without considering its impact on the individuals being portrayed and ridiculed. The cultural functions that celebrity destruction serves within democratic societies include the reinforcement of social norms through negative example, the provision of moral instruction through celebrity downfall narratives, and the creation of social cohesion through shared judgment of public figures who violate community standards or expectations. However, these legitimate social functions must be balanced against considerations of proportionality, accuracy, and basic human dignity that should govern treatment of all individuals regardless of their public status. The international dimensions of American celebrity satirical content distributed globally create complex cultural dynamics where domestic entertainment choices become part of worldwide celebrity discourse in ways that may affect international attitudes toward American culture and values. The global consumption of American celebrity mockery may reinforce negative stereotypes about American society, while contributing to the worldwide exploitation of vulnerable public figures who become international targets of ridicule, contempt. In the somber reflection that follows our examination of fame transformed into weapon, we recognize that celebrity satirical destruction serves as both mirror of societal values and shaper of cultural attitudes towards success, failure, and human vulnerability in public contexts. The finest celebrity satirical content emerges from genuine understanding of power, dynamics, and social responsibility, creating space for legitimate criticism while maintaining recognition of the fundamental humanity that connects creators, audiences, and targets in shared networks of moral obligation and mutual respect. In the complex psychological landscape where childhood innocence encounters adult sexuality and where developing minds attempt to process concepts and experiences far beyond their emotional and cognitive readiness, South Park's exploration of sexual and gender themes through the voices and perspectives of children creates some of the most morally ambiguous and psychologically disturbing content in contemporary television. The show's approach to these mature subjects reveals both the potential for naive perspectives to illuminate adult hypocrisy and dysfunction, and the troubling reality that children's voices can be exploited to discuss topics that would be considered inappropriate or harmful if presented through more direct adult frameworks, creating entertainment that exists in the uncomfortable space between social commentary and the sexualization of childhood innocence. The character of Mr. Garrison represents perhaps the most sustained and complex exploration of gender identity, sexual orientation, and the intersection of personal transformation with social acceptance that has appeared in mainstream animated entertainment. Though the treatment of these themes often prioritizes comedic shock value over sensitive examination of the genuine psychological and social challenges faced by transgender and gender-questioning individuals. Garrison's multiple transitions between male and female identity, combined with his various sexual orientations and relationship patterns, create a character whose gender and sexual journey becomes a source of ongoing comedic material rather than serious exploration of identity development and social acceptance. The psychological complexity underlying Garrison's character development reveals both sophisticated understanding of how gender and sexual identity can evolve throughout individual lifetimes and troubling willingness to treat genuine human experiences of identity, confusion, and social transition as primarily comedic rather than deserving of respectful representation and authentic exploration. His relationships with students, colleagues, and romantic partners become vehicles for exploring social attitudes toward transgender individuals, while potentially reinforcing negative stereotypes and harmful assumptions about gender identity and sexual orientation. The classroom context within which much of Garrison's gender and sexual content is presented create particularly problematic dynamics where children become witnesses to adult sexual and gender expression in ways that blur appropriate boundaries between educational content and personal revelation. The use of elementary school settings for exploration of adult sexuality and gender issues raises questions about the appropriate context for such discussions and the responsibilities that educators bear toward maintaining professional boundaries while serving diverse student populations. The evolution of social attitudes toward Garrison's various transitions and sexual expressions provides commentary on how communities respond to gender and sexual diversity, while potentially reinforcing discriminatory attitudes through comedic framing that makes serious social issues seem trivial or absurd. The inconsistent acceptance and rejection that Garrison experiences from colleagues and community members reflects real-world patterns of discrimination and acceptance, while potentially normalizing negative responses to transgender and gender non-conforming individuals. Big Gay Al's character represents an earlier and somewhat more positive approach to LGBTQ representation within South Park's universe, though his portrayal often relies on stereotypical characteristics and behaviors that may reinforce rather than challenge assumptions about gay men and their roles within heterosexual communities. His relationship with Stan's dog and his involvement in various community activities provide opportunities for exploring homophobia and acceptance, while maintaining enough comedic distance to avoid serious engagement with discrimination and prejudice issues. The Scout Leader episode involving Big Gay Al's dismissal from youth leadership positions because of his sexual orientation provides direct commentary on institutional discrimination and the unfounded fears that often drive exclusion of LGBTQ individuals from roles involving children and youth development. The episode's ultimate resolution, where his competence and character are recognized despite his sexual orientation, offers positive messaging about merit-based evaluation, while potentially oversimplifying the complex institutional and cultural factors that contribute to ongoing LGBTQ discrimination. However, the character design and behavioral patterns associated with Big Gay Al often rely on exaggerated stereotypical characteristics that may reinforce rather than challenge assumptions about gay men and their social roles, creating representation that serves comedic purposes while potentially contributing to the very stereotypes that make genuine inclusion and acceptance more difficult to achieve in real-world contexts. The sexual education themes that emerge throughout various South Park episodes often involve children's naive misunderstanding of adult sexual concepts and practices, creating comedic situations that derive humor from the gap between childhood innocence and adult sexual reality. These storylines reveal both the natural curiosity that children possess about adult behavior and the inadequacy of formal sexual education systems that leave children to develop understanding through peer interaction and media consumption, rather than appropriate educational guidance. The chef character's role as informal sexual educator for the South Park children provides a framework for exploring how adult sexual knowledge is transmitted to children through unofficial channels when formal education systems fail to address natural curiosity and developmental needs. Chef songs and explanations often provide more comprehensive and honest information about sexuality than children receive through official educational channels, though the appropriateness of such discussions between adults and children remains questionable regardless of the educational value provided. The psychological realism of children's questions and misconceptions about sexuality demonstrates sophisticated understanding of childhood development and the natural processes through which children attempt to understand adult behavior and relationships. The specific misunderstandings and confusions that the South Park children experience reflect genuine developmental patterns, while potentially providing educational value for adult viewers who recognize their own childhood confusion and curiosity in these portrayals. The prostitution storyline involving the South Park Children's Kissing Company represents one of the most disturbing explorations of childhood sexuality and the potential for innocent activities to become corrupted through adult night, influence, and commercial pressures. The gradual evolution of simple childhood affection into organized commercial sexual activity demonstrates how easily children can be manipulated into inappropriate situations when adults fail to provide appropriate supervision, guidance. The psychological mechanisms underlying the children's participation in increasingly inappropriate sexual activities reveal how peer pressure, commercial incentives, and adult manipulation can overcome natural childhood boundaries and protective instincts, creating situations where children become complicit in their own exploitation without recognizing the harmful nature of their participation or the long-term consequences of their choices. The adult responses to the children's commercial sexual activities often demonstrate institutional failure and community blindness to child exploitation that occurs within supposedly familiar and safe environments. The inability or unwillingness of parents, teachers, and community leaders to recognize and address inappropriate sexual activity involving children reflects real-world patterns of institutional failure that enable child exploitation and abuse. The ultimate recognition and shutdown of the prostitution operation provides resolution that acknowledges the inappropriateness of commercialized childhood sexuality, while potentially minimizing the psychological trauma and long-term consequences that might result from such experiences in real-world contexts. The comedic framing of serious child welfare issues raises questions about appropriate treatment of childhood sexual exploitation as entertainment content. The gender stereotype themes that appear throughout South Park episodes often involve exaggerated characteristics and behaviors associated with masculine and feminine identity, creating comedic situations through the violation or exaggeration of traditional gender expectations, while potentially reinforcing rather than challenging harmful assumptions about appropriate gender behavior and expression. The toxic masculinity elements that occasionally appear in various storylines demonstrate awareness of how masculine identity expectations can become harmful and destructive, while often failing to provide serious examination of the public. Cultural and psychological factors that create and maintain toxic masculine behavior patterns. The portrayal of masculine competition, aggression, and emotional suppression often serves comedic purposes while potentially normalizing rather than critiquing harmful masculine behavior patterns. The female character development throughout the series reveals both attempts to create strong and complex female characters and ongoing limitations in female representation that reflect broader entertainment industry patterns of male-centered storytelling and perspective. The female characters' relationships with sexuality, career aspirations, and personal agency often remain secondary to male character development and comedic storylines. The romantic relationship themes that emerge through various episodes often involve adult relationship patterns and conflicts presented through childhood perspectives, creating comedic situations while potentially providing insight into how children observe and interpret adult romantic and sexual behavior. The gap between childhood understanding and adult relationship complexity creates opportunities for both humor and social commentary about contemporary relationship culture. The marriage and divorce themes that appear through various family storylines provide commentary on contemporary American family structure and relationship stability, while often prioritizing comedic impact over serious examination of how family disruption affects children and community stability. The treatment of marriage breakdown and family restructuring often emphasizes absurd rather than realistic elements of relationship dissolution. The workplace sexual dynamics that occasionally appear in various episodes often involve inappropriate behavior between adults in professional contexts, providing commentary on sexual harassment and workplace exploitation, while potentially normalizing rather than critiquing harmful workplace behavior patterns. The use of workplace sexual content for comedic purposes raises questions about appropriate treatment of serious professional misconduct issues. The medical and therapeutic contexts within which sexual and gender themes are sometimes explored often involve institutional responses to perceived sexual and gender deviance, providing commentary on how medical and mental health systems pathologize normal human diversity, while potentially reinforcing rather than challenging discriminatory professional practices and diagnostic frameworks. The religious dimensions of sexual and gender content often involve conflict between traditional moral frameworks and contemporary understanding of sexual and gender diversity, creating storylines that explore how religious communities respond to sexual and gender difference, while potentially reinforcing rather than challenging discriminatory religious attitudes and practices. The legal and policy implications of sexual and gender storylines occasionally touch on civil rights protections, anti-discrimination legislation, and legal recognition of diverse family structures, though these themes often remain secondary to comedic content, rather than receiving serious examination and advocacy for equal rights and protections. The international and cultural dimensions of sexual and gender representation within South Park episodes rarely receive sustained attention despite significant global variation in sexual and gender rights, social attitudes, and legal protections that affect LGBTQ individuals' safety and opportunities across different cultural contexts. The historical context of LGBTQ rights and social change occasionally appears in sexual and gender-focused episodes, though often without comprehensive understanding of the ongoing civil rights struggle and the historical patterns of discrimination and activism that shape contemporary sexual and gender politics and social attitudes. The educational potential of sexual and gender content remains largely unrealized due to prioritization of comedic impact over accurate information and respectful representation that might actually contribute to greater understanding and acceptance of sexual and gender diversity within communities and educational institutions. In the quiet reflection that follows our examination of innocence confronting experience, we recognize that the intersection of childhood perspective with adult sexual and gender content creates unique opportunities for social commentary while carrying profound risks of harm to both real children and marginalized communities, whose experiences become sources of entertainment rather than subjects deserving respect and authentic representation. The most responsible approach to such content requires careful balance between comedic expression and recognition of human dignity across all ages and identities. In the shadowed territory where animated violence intersects with real-world tragedy, and where the safe distance of fictional representation collides with the uncomfortable proximity of actual human suffering, South Park's exploration of violence and death creates some of the most psychologically complex and morally challenging content in contemporary entertainment. The show's treatment of mortality, brutality, and societal breakdown reveals both the cathartic potential of animated violence to process collective trauma and individual fear, and the disturbing capacity for entertainment media to normalize and trivialize genuine human suffering through the transformative power of comedic framing and animated distance that allows audiences to laugh at scenarios that would provoke horror and revulsion in real-world contexts. The recurring death and resurrection of Kenny McCormick represents perhaps the most sustained meditation on mortality and meaninglessness in popular culture, transforming the ultimate human fear into a source of ongoing comedic routine, while simultaneously providing profound commentary on how societies process death, grief, and the apparent arbitrariness of human suffering. Kenny's deaths serve multiple narrative and philosophical functions, operating as both reliable comedic formula and existential examination of how individuals and communities respond to repeated exposure to loss and trauma. The psychological mechanisms underlying Kenny's death cycle reveal sophisticated understanding of how repeated exposure to violence and death can create both desensitization and heightened anxiety, depending on individual and contextual factors that affect psychological processing of traumatic content. His friends' increasingly casual responses to his deaths demonstrate how communities can adapt to ongoing tragedy through emotional numbing and ritual normalization that allows continued functioning despite persistent exposure to loss and trauma. The specific methods and circumstances of Kenny's various deaths often reflect contemporary anxieties about safety, technology, and social breakdown, using his mortality as a vehicle for exploring how modern life creates new and unpredictable dangers that individuals cannot easily anticipate or control. The randomness and variety of his death scenarios provide commentary on the unpredictable nature of risk and danger in contemporary society, while potentially contributing to generalized anxiety about safety and security. The resurrection element of Kenny's cycle creates complex theological and philosophical implications about afterlife, continuity of identity, and the meaning of death within systems where mortality may not represent permanent ending. His consistent return from death, without apparent memory of previous deaths, raises questions about consciousness, identity, continuity, and the relationship between physical existence and personal identity that connect to broader philosophical traditions and contemporary neuroscience debates. The community responses to Kenny's deaths often demonstrate how social systems develop coping mechanisms for processing repeated trauma through ritual, denial, and institutional continuation that allows collective functioning despite ongoing individual loss. The South Park community's ability to continue normal operations despite Kenny's frequent deaths reflects both healthy resilience and problematic desensitization to violence and suffering. The Columbine influence on South Park's approach to school violence and youth trauma represents one of the most sensitive intersections between entertainment content and real-world tragedy, where the creator's Colorado origins and personal connections to affected communities create both special insight and particular responsibility in addressing themes of school safety, youth violence, and community trauma response. The show's handling of school violence themes demonstrates awareness of how entertainment media can either contribute to or help process collective trauma related to school safety concerns. The specific episodes that address school violence and youth aggression often employ satirical distance and comedic framing to explore serious issues related to bullying, social isolation, and institutional failure that contribute to school violence incidents. Though the appropriateness of using comedy to address such serious topics remains contentious, given the ongoing impact of school violence on communities and families affected by such tragedies. The psychological realism of social dynamics that contribute to school violence, including peer rejection, adult neglect, and institutional indifference, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of risk factors and warning signs, while potentially providing educational value for audiences who recognize similar patterns in their own educational and community environments. However, the comedic treatment of serious risk factors may minimize their importance and discourage appropriate intervention and prevention efforts. The institutional responses to school violence concerns within South Park episodes often satirize zero-tolerance policies, security measures, and administrative overreactions that may create additional problems while failing to address underlying causes of youth violence and social breakdown. The critique of institutional responses provides valuable commentary on educational policy while potentially undermining legitimate safety measures and prevention efforts. The media coverage and public hysteria that often accompany school violence incidents receive satirical treatment that illuminates how news coverage and public discourse can amplify fear and anxiety while potentially inspiring copycat incidents through excessive attention and inappropriate glorification of perpetrators. The commentary on media responsibility and public discourse provides important perspective while potentially contributing to the very dynamics it seeks to criticize. The Cartman Chutes token incident represents the most direct engagement with police violence and racial injustice within South Park's catalog, using the framework of zombie apocalypse satire to explore how racial bias affects perception of threat and justification for violence against racial minorities. The episode's combination of horror movie parody with commentary on contemporary police violence creates complex narrative territory where entertainment tropes intersect with serious social justice issues. The psychological dynamics underlying the shooting incident, including Cartman's perception of threat and his subsequent legal and social justification, provides satirical commentary on how racial bias operates in high-stress decision-making situations, while potentially trivializing genuine concerns about police violence and racial injustice through comedic framing and fictional distance. The legal and social aftermath of the shooting, where Cartman faces minimal consequences and receives support for his actions, provides commentary on how justice systems and community responses often fail to address racial violence appropriately, while potentially reinforcing harmful narratives about justified violence against racial minorities and the just acceptability of racial bias in threat assessment and response. The broader community response to the shooting incident reveals how social systems can rally around perpetrators of racial violence while ignoring or minimizing the experiences and perspectives of victims and affected communities, reflecting real-world patterns of institutional bias and community denial that enable ongoing racial violence and injustice. The international warfare themes that appear throughout various South Park episodes often employ animated violence to explore contemporary military conflicts, international relations, and the human costs of political and economic competition between nations. The use of animated characters to represent real nations and conflicts creates distance that allows exploration of serious geopolitical issues, while potentially minimizing their genuine human impact and complexity. The specific military conflicts that receive satirical treatment often reflect contemporary American military involvement and foreign policy decisions, providing commentary on war justification, military strategy, and domestic support for international intervention, while potentially influencing public attitudes toward complex geopolitical situations through simplified entertainment frameworks. The civilian casualties and collateral damage that result from animated warfare provide commentary on how modern military conflicts affect non-combatant populations, while potentially normalizing violence against civilian populations through comedic treatment and animated distance that reduces genuine human suffering to entertainment content. The veteran and military family themes that occasionally appear in warfare-focused episodes provide opportunities for exploring how military service affects individuals and families, while often failing to address the complex realities of military life, deployment stress, and veteran reintegration that characterize contemporary military service and its aftermath. The domestic violence themes that emerge through various family and relationship storylines often involve inappropriate behavior between family members and intimate partners, providing opportunities for commentary on family dysfunction and relationship abuse, while potentially normalizing harmful behavior patterns through comedic treatment and animated distance. The child abuse elements that appear in various episodes involving family dysfunction often reflect real patterns of childhood trauma and family violence, while potentially minimizing the serious psychological and physical consequences of child abuse through comedic framing and narrative resolution that suggests minimal lasting impact from traumatic experiences. The substance abuse and addiction themes that contribute to family violence and social breakdown in various episodes provide commentary on how addiction affects individuals and communities, while often failing to address the complex social, economic, and psychological factors that contribute to substance abuse problems and their treatment and prevention. The mental health dimensions of violence and aggression that appear throughout various episodes often involve characters whose psychological problems contribute to harmful behavior toward others, providing opportunities for exploring how mental illness intersects with violence, while potentially reinforcing harmful stereotypes about mental illness and dangerousness that contribute to discrimination and stigma. The trauma processing and psychological healing themes that emerge in the aftermath of violent incidents often demonstrate both healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms, while potentially providing educational value about trauma response and recovery processes. Though the comedic treatment of serious psychological issues may minimize their importance and discourage appropriate mental health intervention, the community resilience and recovery themes that appear following major violent incidents or social breakdown provide commentary on how communities can rebuild and heal from collective trauma, while potentially offering hope and guidance for real communities facing similar challenges. Though the simplified resolution of complex trauma may not reflect realistic recovery timelines and processes, the cultural and historical contexts within which animated violence occurs often reflect broader patterns of social conflict, cultural change, and historical trauma that shape contemporary social relationships and community dynamics, providing opportunities for educational content about social history, while potentially oversimplifying complex historical processes and their ongoing impact. The international perspectives on violence and conflict that appear in various episodes often reflect American viewpoints and cultural assumptions about global relationships and conflict resolution, potentially reinforcing provincial thinking, while failing to acknowledge diverse international perspectives on violence, justice, and community healing that might provide valuable alternative approaches. The technological dimensions of contemporary violence, including digital harassment, cyberbullying, and online radicalization, receive limited attention within South Park's violence-focused content, despite their increasing importance in contemporary conflict and harm. reflecting both the show's focus on traditional violence forms and potential gaps in understanding emerging forms of harm and aggression. The economic factors that contribute to violence and social breakdown, including poverty, inequality, and resource competition, rarely receive sustained examination within violence-focused episodes. Despite their crucial role in creating conditions that increase violence risk and limit community capacity for prevention and healing efforts, the prevention and intervention themes that might provide constructive alternatives to violence and conflict resolution rarely receive serious treatment within episodes focused on violence and trauma, potentially missing opportunities to provide educational content about conflict resolution, violence prevention, and community healing that might serve valuable social functions. In the somber contemplation that follows our examination of violence transformed into entertainment, we recognize that animated brutality serves both as mirror, reflecting societal fears and anxieties about safety and mortality, and as potential catalyst for either greater understanding of violence, prevention, and trauma healing, or further desensitization to genuine human suffering that requires serious attention and compassionate response rather than comedic distance and entertainment consumption. In the treacherous intersection where physical suffering becomes comedic material and human vulnerability transforms into entertainment content, South Park's exploration of medical conditions, disease, and health crises reveals both society's uncomfortable relationship with illness and mortality, and the complex psychological mechanisms through which communities process collective anxiety about bodily fragility and medical uncertainty. The show's treatment of health-related themes demonstrates how comedy can serve as both coping mechanism for confronting medical fears and potentially harmful vehicle for minimizing genuine suffering while reinforcing stigma and discrimination against individuals whose bodies and minds operate outside conventional parameters of health and normalcy. The AIDS is Finally Funny episode represents one of the most morally complex examinations of how societies determine appropriate targets for humor while grappling with the temporal dimensions of tragedy and the evolutionary nature of comedic acceptability. The episode's central premise, that sufficient time has passed since the AIDS crisis began to make the disease an acceptable subject for comedic treatment, provides satirical commentary on how communities develop social rules, governing the appropriate timing for transforming tragedy into entertainment, while simultaneously participating in the very process it claims to examine and critique. The psychological mechanisms underlying the declaration that AIDS has become acceptable comedic material reveal sophisticated understanding of how temporal distance affects emotional processing of collective trauma and individual suffering, demonstrating awareness that tragedy often transforms into comedy through gradual social processes that may reflect either healthy healing or problematic desensitization, depending on contextual factors and community responses to ongoing suffering and loss. The Jared Fogle subplot within the AIDS episode creates complex layers of meaning where health advocacy becomes confused with disease transmission through linguistic misunderstanding and deliberate wordplay that transforms legitimate public health messaging into source of confusion and inappropriate humor. The character's genuine intention to help people achieve weight loss through assistance becomes corrupted through audience misinterpretation that assumes he is promoting disease transmission rather than health improvement. The community panic that emerges from the misunderstood health messaging provides satirical commentary on how public health communication can be distorted through media coverage and social misunderstanding while potentially contributing to genuine confusion about disease transmission and prevention that may affect real health behaviors and outcomes. The episode's treatment of AIDS awareness and prevention messaging risks undermining legitimate public health efforts while providing entertainment through health-related confusion. The resolution of the linguistic misunderstanding, where the actual meaning of assistance is clarified while simultaneously declaring AIDS an acceptable target for humor, creates complex moral territory where health advocacy intersects with comedic permission in ways that may serve neither public health nor appropriate respect for ongoing suffering of individuals and communities affected by AIDS and related health challenges. The retrospective viewing of the Fogel-focused content following his later criminal conviction creates additional interpretive complexity where health advocacy content becomes entangled with criminal behavior in ways that may affect audience perception of both health messaging and celebrity endorsement of public health initiatives, potentially undermining legitimate health advocacy through association with criminal activity. The COVID-19 pandemic episodes represent South Park's most contemporary engagement with global health crisis and the complex social, political, and psychological dynamics that emerge during widespread disease outbreaks that affect entire populations simultaneously. The show's treatment of pandemic themes demonstrates both sophisticated understanding of how communities respond to collective health threats and problematic willingness to transform ongoing global suffering into immediate entertainment content. The origin story provided for the COVID-19 virus, involving inappropriate sexual contact between fictional characters and wildlife species, creates satirical commentary on the scientific investigation of disease origins, while potentially contributing to harmful conspiracy theories and xenophobic attitudes towards specific populations and regions blamed for disease emergence. Transmission. The characterization of pandemic response measures, including masking requirements, social distancing protocols, and business closures, often emphasizes their inconvenience and social disruption rather than their public health necessity, potentially undermining legitimate disease prevention efforts, while providing entertainment through the mockery of protective behaviors and institutional responses designed to reduce disease transmission and protect vulnerable populations. The individual and community responses to pandemic restrictions and lifestyle changes receive satirical treatment that may reflect genuine social tensions and psychological struggles, while potentially minimizing the serious health risks that justify temporary lifestyle modifications and the genuine sacrifices made by individuals and communities to protect collective health and safety. The medical misinformation and conspiracy theory themes that emerge within pandemic-focused episodes provide commentary on how false information spreads during health crises, while potentially contributing to the very misinformation patterns they claim to satirize through the amplification of conspiracy narratives and the undermining of legitimate public health authority and scientific expertise. The mental health implications of pandemic isolation and social disruption receive limited attention within COVID-focused episodes, despite their significant impact on individual and community psychological well-being, potentially missing opportunities to address serious mental health consequences of prolonged social isolation and economic uncertainty that accompany major health crises. The medical treatment and psychiatric intervention themes that appear throughout various South Park episodes often involve institutional responses to perceived behavioral and psychological problems that prioritize control and normalization over genuine understanding and appropriate support for individuals experiencing mental health challenges or developmental differences that require specialized care and accommodation rather than correction or elimination. The psychiatric hospitalization incidents that occur in various episodes often present mental health treatment as punishment or control mechanism, rather than genuine therapeutic intervention designed to support individual healing and psychological growth, potentially reinforcing harmful stereotypes about mental health treatment and discouraging appropriate help-seeking behavior among individuals who might benefit from professional mental health support. The medication and pharmaceutical themes that emerge in various health-focused episodes often emphasize negative side effects and inappropriate prescribing practices rather than the legitimate benefits that appropriate medical treatment can provide for individuals with genuine health conditions requiring professional medical management and ongoing care coordination. The therapy and counseling sessions that appear throughout various episodes often portray mental health professionals as incompetent or manipulative, rather than skilled practitioners providing valuable services, potentially undermining confidence in legitimate mental health treatment and discouraging individuals from seeking appropriate professional support during times of psychological distress or personal crisis. The family responses to medical and mental health challenges often demonstrate dysfunctional communication patterns and inappropriate boundary violations, rather than healthy support systems that facilitate healing and recovery, potentially reinforcing harmful family dynamics while failing to model appropriate responses to health challenges and treatment needs. The disability and chronic illness themes that appear in various health-focused episodes often emphasize limitations and social challenges rather than the adaptive capabilities and community contributions that characterize many individuals living with ongoing health conditions, potentially reinforcing ableist attitudes and discrimination against disabled and chronically ill community members. The alternative medicine and health fad themes that receive satirical treatment in various episodes often focus on obviously problematic practices, while potentially undermining legitimate integrative healthcare approaches that may provide valuable supplements to conventional medical treatment for individuals with complex health needs requiring multiple therapeutic modalities. The public health emergency and disease outbreak scenarios that appear throughout various episodes often emphasize panic and social breakdown, rather than effective community coordination and mutual support that characterize successful public health responses to collective health challenges, potentially undermining confidence in public health systems and community resilience during actual health emergencies. The medical research and scientific investigation themes that emerge in health-focused episodes often portray researchers and healthcare professionals as incompetent or malicious, rather than dedicated professionals working to advance human health and well-being through rigorous scientific investigation and evidence-based practice development that serves genuine public health interests. The healthcare system and medical institution themes that receive satirical treatment often emphasize dysfunction and profit motivation rather than the genuine dedication and professional competence that characterizes much healthcare delivery, potentially undermining confidence in legitimate medical institutions and healthcare professionals who provide essential services to individuals and communities. The pharmaceutical industry and drug development themes that appear in various health-focused episodes often emphasize corporate greed and harmful practices, rather than the legitimate contributions that pharmaceutical research and development make to human health through the creation of life-saving medications and treatments that address previously untreatable conditions and improve quality of life for millions of individuals. The health insurance and healthcare access themes that occasionally appear in medical episodes often focus on system failures and coverage limitations, rather than exploring the complex policy and economic factors that affect healthcare, accessibility, and the potential solutions that might improve healthcare, equity, and availability for underserved populations. The medical ethics and healthcare decision-making themes that emerge in various health-focused episodes often emphasize conflict and controversy rather than the thoughtful deliberation and ethical reflection that characterizes much medical practice and healthcare policy development, potentially undermining confidence in healthcare decision-making processes and professional medical judgment. The global health and international disease themes that appear in various episodes often reflect American perspectives and assumptions about international health challenges, while potentially missing opportunities to explore global health, equity issues, and the international cooperation necessary for addressing worldwide health challenges that affect all populations. The health education and prevention themes that could provide valuable public health messaging rarely receive serious treatment within health-focused episodes, potentially missing opportunities to contribute to genuine health promotion and disease prevention efforts that serve legitimate public health interests and individual well-being. The recovery and rehabilitation themes that might provide hope and guidance for individuals facing serious health challenges rarely receive sustained attention within medical episodes, potentially missing opportunities to provide encouragement and practical information about healing and adaptation that could serve valuable social functions. In the contemplative silence that follows our examination of suffering transformed into spectacle, we recognize that medical humor serves complex psychological and social functions that range from healthy coping mechanisms for processing anxiety about mortality and vulnerability to harmful minimization of genuine human suffering that deserves compassionate attention rather than comedic exploitation, requiring careful consideration of the distinction between humor that heals and humor that harms. In the volatile arena of contemporary political discourse, where ideological conviction collides with satirical irreverence and partisan loyalty wrestles with comedic transgression, South Park's approach to political incorrectness represents both a deliberate rejection of contemporary sensitivity culture and a complex examination of how humor can serve as vehicle for exploring the most contentious and divisive issues that fragment democratic societies into warring camps of ideological purity and mutual incomprehension. The show's willingness to violate political taboos and challenge orthodox thinking across the entire spectrum of contemporary political belief demonstrates both the democratic value of irreverent commentary that refuses to respect artificial boundaries around acceptable discourse and the potential danger of entertainment that prioritizes shock value over genuine insight, while potentially contributing to the very polarization and mutual contempt that threatens democratic institutions and civil discourse. The fundamental philosophy underlying South Park's approach to political incorrectness operates through systematic violation of contemporary sensitivity protocols and deliberate transgression against the expanding catalogue of subjects that progressive and conservative orthodoxies have deemed inappropriate for satirical treatment or critical examination. This approach reflects both genuine commitment to free expression and intellectual independence, and calculated commercial strategy that recognizes controversy as reliable generator of audience engagement and cultural relevance in saturated entertainment markets where attention becomes increasingly difficult to capture and maintain. The equal opportunity offense principle that governs much of South Park's political content demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how satirical fairness requires willingness to challenge all ideological positions rather than serving partisan interests or ideological constituencies that might prefer selective satirical attack against their political opponents, while demanding immunity from similar treatment for their own beliefs and assumptions. This democratic approach to satirical criticism serves valuable functions within pluralistic societies that require ongoing examination of all truth claims and power structures, regardless of their political popularity or cultural protection status. However, the practical implementation of equal opportunity offense often creates false equivalencies between significantly different levels of social harm and political power that may distort rather than illuminate genuine moral and political distinctions between competing ideological positions and policy proposals. The satirical treatment of marginalized communities and established power structures as equivalent targets for humor fails to acknowledge power differentials that affect the real-world impact of satirical attack and the different consequences that flow from challenging authority versus mocking vulnerability. The immigration episodes that appear throughout South Park's political catalogue reveal complex attitudes toward cultural change, national identity, and economic competition that reflect broader American anxieties about demographic transformation while employing satirical frameworks that allow exploration of sensitive topics through comedic distance and animated representation. The show's treatment of immigration themes often demonstrates awareness of economic and cultural factors that drive both immigration and anti-immigration sentiment, while potentially reinforcing rather than challenging xenophobic attitudes through repetition of common stereotypes and fears. The undocumented immigrant storylines that emerge in various episodes often focus on economic competition and cultural assimilation challenges, while potentially minimizing the human costs of immigration enforcement and the genuine hardships faced by individuals and families seeking safety and opportunity across national borders. The comedic treatment of immigration, enforcement, and deportation processes risks trivializing serious human rights concerns while failing to acknowledge the complex international and economic factors that drive contemporary migration patterns. The border security and wall construction themes that receive satirical treatment often emphasize the absurdity and ineffectiveness of physical barriers, while potentially contributing to broader political discourse about immigration policy. Through entertainment frameworks that may influence public attitudes toward complex policy issues, requiring nuanced understanding of international relations, economic development, and human rights principles. The sanctuary city and local immigration policy themes that appear in various political episodes provide commentary on federalism and local autonomy, while potentially oversimplifying the complex legal and practical challenges that local communities face when federal immigration enforcement conflicts with local public safety priorities and community policing strategies that require trust and cooperation between law enforcement and immigrant communities. The economic inequality episodes that explore wealth distribution, corporate power, and class conflict demonstrate awareness of how economic systems create winners and losers, while often employing satirical frameworks that may minimize rather than illuminate the serious consequences of economic inequality for individual, opportunity, and democratic governance. The treatment of poverty and wealth through comedic lenses risks normalizing rather than challenging economic systems that create systematic disadvantage and limit social mobility. The corporate power and business influence themes that receive satirical attention often focus on obvious examples of corporate malfeasance, while potentially failing to examine the more subtle ways that concentrated economic power affects democratic decision-making and policy development. Through lobbying, campaign contributions, and regulatory capture that serve corporate interests rather than public welfare. The labor organization and worker rights themes that occasionally appear in economically focused episodes often portray unions and worker advocacy as outdated or counterproductive, rather than examining contemporary challenges facing workers in changing economic contexts that may require collective action and government regulation to ensure fair wages and safe working conditions. The taxation and government spending themes that emerge in various political episodes often emphasize government waste and inefficiency, while potentially undermining public confidence in democratic governance and collective action that serves legitimate public interests, including infrastructure, development, education funding, and social safety net programs that support individual opportunity and community well-being. The election parody episodes that appear during major political campaigns demonstrate sophisticated understanding of campaign strategies and voter psychology, while often employing cynical frameworks that may contribute to political disengagement and voter apathy, rather than encouraging informed civic participation and democratic engagement that democratic societies require for legitimate governance and policy development. The candidate characterization in political episodes often relies on exaggerated personality traits and obvious flaws, while potentially failing to examine policy differences and governance philosophies that should inform voter decision-making and democratic choice between competing visions of government role and public policy priorities. The voting and electoral process themes that receive satirical treatment often emphasize confusion and manipulation rather than the genuine democratic deliberation and civic engagement that characterize healthy democratic systems, potentially discouraging political participation and civic involvement that democracy requires for legitimate governance and responsive policy development. The media coverage and political journalism themes that appear in election-focused episodes often portray news coverage as biased and manipulative, while potentially contributing to broader distrust of journalism and information, systems that democratic societies require for informed public discourse and accountability of political leaders and institutions. The campaign finance and political corruption themes that occasionally receive satirical attention often focus on obvious examples of inappropriate influence, while potentially missing opportunities to examine systematic problems with money in politics that require structural reforms to ensure democratic responsiveness to public interests, rather than donor preferences and special interest priorities. The international relations episodes that explore American foreign policy and diplomatic relationships often reflect provincial American perspectives, while potentially contributing to public attitudes toward complex international challenges that require nuanced understanding of global politics, economic relationships, and cultural differences between nations and regions. The military intervention and warfare themes that receive political treatment often emphasize American interests and perspectives, while potentially failing to acknowledge the human costs and international implications of military action that affects populations and nations beyond American borders, requiring consideration of international law and humanitarian principles that constrain legitimate use of military force. The trade and economic relationship themes that appear in internationally focused political episodes often reflect American economic anxieties, while potentially oversimplifying complex global economic relationships that require international cooperation and mutual understanding rather than zero-sum competition and protectionist policies that may harm both domestic and international economic development. The environmental policy episodes that address climate change, pollution, and resource conservation often employ satirical frameworks that may undermine, rather than support, legitimate environmental protection efforts, while failing to acknowledge the scientific consensus and policy urgency that characterize contemporary environmental challenges requiring immediate and Sustained political action. The energy policy and environmental regulation themes that receive political treatment often emphasize economic costs and lifestyle inconvenience, rather than long-term environmental and public health benefits that justify temporary economic adjustment and regulatory oversight of industrial activities that affect air and water quality and ecosystem health. The healthcare policy episodes that explore medical insurance, treatment access, and public health programs often focus on system inefficiencies, while potentially undermining support for healthcare reforms that could improve health outcomes and reduce medical bankruptcy and preventable illness that affect millions of patients for Americans who lack adequate healthcare coverage and access. The education policy themes that appear in school-focused episodes often emphasize institutional dysfunction, while potentially undermining support for public education funding and reform efforts that require sustained political commitment and community investment in educational quality and teacher support that serves student learning and democratic citizenship development. The criminal justice and law enforcement themes that receive political treatment often focus on individual cases rather than examining systematic problems with incarceration rates, racial bias, and police accountability that require comprehensive reforms to ensure fair and effective law enforcement that serves public safety while protecting constitutional rights and community trust. In the reflective quiet that follows our examination of politics transformed into entertainment, we recognize that political, satirical content serves both essential democratic functions of challenging authority and examining competing truth claims, and potentially harmful functions of undermining civic engagement and democratic institutions through cynicism that discourages the political participation and informed discourse that democratic governance requires for legitimacy and effectiveness in serving public interests and protecting individual rights within pluralistic societies that depend on mutual respect and good faith political engagement. In the labyrinthine depths of human psychology, where cognitive processes intersect with cultural conditioning and neurological hardwiring collides with social learning, the phenomenon of transgressive humor reveals profound truths about the fundamental architecture of consciousness and the complex mechanisms through which individuals and societies process information that challenges moral boundaries and violates established social norms. The psychological appeal of offensive humor operates through intricate networks of neural activation, emotional release, and social bonding that demonstrate both the adaptive functions of transgressive laughter and its potentially destructive capacity to reinforce harmful attitudes and behaviors that contribute to social fragmentation and individual psychological damage. The neurological basis of inappropriate laughter emerges from ancient brain structures that evolved to facilitate social bonding and stress relief through shared recognition of incongruity and violation of expected patterns, creating physiological responses that generate pleasure and social connection through collective acknowledgement of rule-breaking and boundary violation. The brain's reward systems activate when encountering humor that violates social expectations while remaining within bounds of psychological safety, creating neurochemical responses that reinforce attention and memory formation around transgressive content that challenges conventional thinking and behavioral norms. However, the same neurological mechanisms that enable healthy stress relief and social bonding through humor can become corrupted when repeatedly exposed to content that normalizes genuine harm or reinforces discriminatory attitudes toward vulnerable populations who become objects of ridicule rather than subjects deserving respect and protection. The plasticity of neural networks means that consistent exposure to offensive humor can reshape cognitive patterns and emotional responses in ways that may increase tolerance for actual discrimination and harmful behavior, while decreasing empathy and concern for individuals and groups who become habituated targets of comedic attack. The psychological functions served by taboo humor include emotional regulation through the safe expression of forbidden thoughts and feelings, cognitive flexibility through the exploration of alternative perspectives and moral frameworks, and social cohesion through shared violation of conventional boundaries that create in-group solidarity and collective identity. These adaptive functions explain why transgressive humor appears across all human cultures and historical periods, serving essential roles in psychological health and social functioning that cannot be easily replaced by more conventional forms of entertainment or social interaction. The cathartic potential of offensive humor allows individuals to process difficult emotions and social tensions through comedic frameworks that provide psychological distance and emotional safety, while exploring themes and experiences that might otherwise prove overwhelming or traumatic when encountered directly. The transformation of anxiety, anger, and fear into laughter serves legitimate psychological needs for emotional regulation and stress management that contribute to individual mental health and community resilience during periods of social tension and collective challenge. The social bonding function of transgressive humor creates powerful feelings of intimacy and belonging among individuals who share willingness to engage with forbidden content and violate conventional social boundaries together, generating collective identity and mutual loyalty through shared transgression that distinguishes in-group members from those who remain bound by conventional moral constraints and social expectations. This bonding process can serve healthy social functions by creating communities of individuals who support each other's authentic expression and resist social conformity pressures that might inhibit creative thinking and individual development. However, the same social bonding mechanisms that create healthy community through shared transgression can become pathological when they operate through the exclusion and dehumanization of out-group members who become targets rather than participants in transgressive humor, creating solidarity through collective cruelty rather than mutual support and authentic connection. The distinction between humor that bonds through shared vulnerability versus humor that bonds through shared attack often determines whether transgressive content serves constructive or destructive social functions. The cognitive dissonance generated by exposure to offensive humor creates psychological tension that can either promote growth and self-examination or trigger defensive responses that protect existing beliefs and attitudes from challenge and modification. When individuals encounter humor that challenges their assumptions or forces recognition of contradictions within their worldview, they may respond through genuine reflection and potential attitude change, or they may resolve the dissonance through dismissal of the challenging content or rationalization of their existing beliefs and behaviors. The resolution of cognitive dissonance triggered by transgressive humor often depends on individual psychological factors, including openness to experience, intellectual humility, and existing belief strength, as well as social factors, including peer support for reflection versus conformity, and institutional encouragement of critical thinking versus ideological consistency. The educational potential of offensive humor remains largely unrealized when audiences lack adequate support for processing challenging content in constructive rather than defensive ways. The temporal dimensions of transgressive humor reveal how changing social consciousness affects both the creation and reception of offensive content, with jokes that seemed acceptable within previous cultural moments becoming problematic as awareness of harm and discrimination develops. Through social activism and expanded understanding of marginalized experiences. The evolution of comedic boundaries demonstrates both healthy social progress toward greater inclusion and respect, and potentially problematic restriction of expressive freedom that may inhibit authentic exploration of complex social issues. The individual variation in response to offensive humor reflects complex interactions between personality traits, cultural background, personal experience, and social position that affect both tolerance for transgressive content and interpretation of comedic intent and impact. Individuals with direct experience of discrimination or marginalization may respond differently to offensive humor than those whose social position protects them from similar targeting, creating disparate impact that may not be immediately apparent to creators or audiences who lack similar experiential backgrounds. The cultural specificity of transgressive humor demonstrates how comedic boundaries and transgressive appeal are shaped by particular historical contexts, social hierarchies, and collective experiences that may not translate across cultural boundaries or temporal periods, creating content that may be deeply meaningful within specific contexts while appearing incomprehensible or offensive when encountered by audiences from different cultural backgrounds or historical periods. The commercial incentives that shape transgressive humor within entertainment industries create systematic pressures toward increasingly extreme content that generates audience, engagement, and media attention regardless of social impact or long-term consequences for targeted individuals and communities, potentially corrupting the authentic psychological and social functions of transgressive humor through market-driven escalation and sensationalism that prioritizes profit over genuine artistic or social value. The legal frameworks that govern offensive humor within different social and political contexts reveal complex tensions between expressive freedom and protection from harm that democratic societies must navigate through ongoing negotiation and institutional adaptation that balances competing values and interests while protecting both creative expression and individual dignity within pluralistic communities that include diverse perspectives and experiences. The international dimensions of transgressive humor in globally distributed entertainment create complex cultural dynamics where locally produced content becomes part of worldwide discourse about acceptable boundaries and appropriate targets for comedic treatment, potentially exporting cultural attitudes and prejudices that may not be appropriate or welcome within different social contexts and value systems. The educational potential of transgressive humor remains largely unrealized due to inadequate frameworks for processing challenging content in constructive ways that promote genuine understanding and empathy rather than defensive reaction or harmful attitude reinforcement, suggesting need for media literacy, education, and critical thinking skills that enable audiences to engage with complex content thoughtfully rather than passively consuming entertainment without consideration of its broader social implications and effects. The therapeutic applications of transgressive humor within clinical and educational contexts demonstrate both potential benefits for trauma processing and social skill development, and significant risks of harm when inappropriate content is used without adequate professional supervision and participant consent, requiring careful consideration of individual needs and circumstances that affect whether transgressive humor serves healing or harmful functions. The community impact of transgressive humor extends beyond individual entertainment consumption to affect broader social norms and collective attitudes toward difference, diversity, and inclusion within communities, where shared consumption of offensive content may either promote understanding and empathy or reinforce prejudice and discrimination, depending on how such content is presented and processed within social contexts. The generational differences in response to transgressive humor reflect changing social consciousness and evolving understanding of harm and discrimination that affect both tolerance for offensive content and interpretation of comedic intent and impact, creating intergenerational tension around appropriate boundaries and acceptable targets for comedic treatment that require ongoing dialogue and mutual understanding rather than dismissive judgment or ideological rigidity. The prevention and intervention strategies that might address harmful impacts of transgressive humor while preserving beneficial functions require comprehensive understanding of psychological mechanisms and social dynamics that distinguish constructive from destructive applications of offensive content, suggesting need for research and policy development that protects both expressive freedom and individual dignity within diverse democratic communities. The future evolution of transgressive humor will likely reflect ongoing changes in social consciousness, technological capability, and global interconnection that affect both creation and distribution of offensive content, requiring adaptive frameworks for evaluation and response that maintain essential psychological and social functions, while minimizing harm to vulnerable individuals and communities who deserve protection from systematic targeting and dehumanization through entertainment media. In the profound stillness that follows our exploration of laughter's darkest territories, we recognize that transgressive humor serves as both mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and prejudices, and potential catalyst for growth through the uncomfortable recognition of our own capacity for cruelty and our shared vulnerability to harm, requiring wisdom and compassion to distinguish between humor that heals through honest self-examination and humor that damages through cruelty disguised as entertainment. As our journey through South Park's darkest corridors draws to a close, we find ourselves confronted with the complex relationship between humor and harm, between pushing boundaries and respecting humanity. These controversial moments remind us that comedy, at its most powerful, forces us to examine our own discomfort and question why certain topics make us squirm. Perhaps the greatest lesson from South Park's most offensive moments is not that everything should be mocked, but that our reactions to mockery reveal as much about ourselves as they do about the creators. In the gentle darkness of sleep, we can acknowledge that laughter sometimes comes from uncomfortable places, that growth often requires discomfort, and that even our most problematic entertainment can serve as mirrors reflecting our collective anxieties and evolving values. Rest now, knowing that in a world full of serious problems, sometimes the most serious response is to laugh at our own absurdity. Sleep peacefully, with the understanding that tomorrow we can choose to be better than we were today, even if we sometimes laugh at things we probably shouldn't.